The house wasn't on any map. I found it by accident, or maybe it found me. I was driving home after a late shift, the kind that stretches hours longer than it should, leaving your mind fogged and your body running on caffeine and autopilot. The highway was empty, the darkness beyond my headlights unbroken. My GPS had died miles back, but I thought I knew the route well enough to manage. Then the road curved sharply where it never had before. I slammed the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the asphalt. I was sure I'd taken this highway dozens of times, but the curve wasn't familiar, nor was the narrow, dirt path branching off from it, flanked by tall, skeletal trees. A wooden sign stood at the entrance, its paint weathered and cracked, but I could still make out the word, "Welcome." I don't know why I turned down the path. There was no logic to it, just a strange pull I couldn't explain. The trees closed in quickly, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. My car's headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the dirt road seemed endless. Then I saw it. The house loomed at the end of the path, its silhouette stark against the night sky. It was massive, its roof jagged and uneven, as though pieces of it had been added over decades without thought for symmetry. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its railings warped and splintered. The windows were dark, but I could feel something behind them watching me. I should have turned back. Instead, I parked and stepped out, the cool night air biting at my skin. The gravel crunched underfoot as I approached the house, and I noticed a faint glow coming from the porch. A lantern hung from a rusted hook near the door, its flame flickering weakly. Beneath it, a small plaque was nailed to the wood. "You've been expected." I froze. There was no way anyone could have known I'd be here. I hadn't even known. Before I could convince myself to leave, the door creaked open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. A fire crackled in a stone hearth at the far end, the only source of light. The air smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. "Come in," a voice said. It was soft, almost melodic, but it carried an edge that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. A woman sat by the fire, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, cascading over the shoulders of a high-backed chair. She held a book in her lap, her fingers tracing the pages as though she were reading Braille. "You're late," she said without looking up. "For what?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She turned then, and my breath caught. Her face was pale, unnaturally smooth, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. Her lips curved into a smile, but it didn't feel welcoming. "For your story," she said, gesturing to a small table beside her. A quill and an inkwell sat on its surface, alongside a thick, leather-bound book. "I don't understand," I said, my pulse hammering. "You will." The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing closer. The air grew heavier, suffused with a tension that made my skin crawl. "Sit," she commanded, and though every part of me wanted to run, my legs carried me to the chair opposite hers. The book on the table was open, its pages blank. "Right," she said, pushing the quill toward me. I shook my head. "I don't know what you want me to write." Her smile widened, her teeth too white, too sharp. "You don't need to. It will come to you." When I hesitated, her eyes narrowed, and the fire behind her flared, casting wild shadows across the room. I picked up the quill. The moment the tip touched the page, words spilled out, flowing faster than I could process. My hand moved on its own, guided by some unseen force. The letters were strange, jagged, forming a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The story unfolded in vivid detail, each word pulling memories from a place I didn't know existed. It wasn't my life I was writing. It was something else entirely. A tale of betrayal and hunger, of a creature bound to a house that fed on the unwary. The woman's gaze burned into me as I wrote, her smile never wavering. When the final word was etched onto the page, my hand stilled. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Your part in the cycle," she said. The fire died suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. When I awoke, I was back in my car, the engine idling at the side of the highway. The dirt path and the house were gone, as though they'd never existed. But the book was in my lap. Its pages were no longer blank. The story I'd written stared back at me, the words pulsing faintly, as though alive. And at the very end, scrawled in my own handwriting, was a single line I didn't remember writing. The house is waiting. I've tried burning the book, shredding it, even burying it deep in the woods. It always finds its way back, pristine and whole. And now, late at night, I hear the creak of a door opening somewhere close, followed by the faint flicker of a lantern's light. The house hasn't forgotten me, and it's hungry. The first time I noticed the window was open, I didn't think much of it. It was the kind of small detail you brush past on a busy morning, an unexpected breeze stirring the curtains as I poured coffee. But by the third day, it began to nag at me. We didn't keep the bedroom window open, not even in spring. It faced the alley, where the air smelled faintly of exhaust and damp pavement. I closed it with a firm snap and moved on, but something about it lingered in the back of my mind. That evening, as he pulled on his running shoes, I mentioned it casually. "Have you been leaving the window open?" He shook his head, focused on tying the laces. "No, maybe the latch is loose." It wasn't loose. I checked. He kissed me on the cheek and jogged out the door, his usual route taking him through the park and back in 45 minutes. But tonight, I felt restless. The house felt too still, the window too perfectly closed. I decided to follow him. Pulling on a hoodie, I slipped out the door and kept my distance as he ran. His pace was steady, predictable, following the path I could have traced in my sleep. Until it wasn't. Just before the park, he turned left onto a quiet side street I didn't recognize. I stopped, watching as he jogged to a small brick house with ivy creeping up the walls. He slowed, checked his phone, then knocked lightly on the door. It opened a moment later, and a woman stepped out. She smiled, a soft, familiar smile, and handed him a folded piece of paper. He didn't go inside. The exchange was brief, almost businesslike, but the intimacy in their movements was unmistakable. He touched her arm lightly, and she nodded before retreating back into the house. I waited until he was gone, then walked up to the door. My hand hovered over the knocker, but I couldn't bring myself to use it. Instead, I turned and hurried back home, my thoughts racing. When he returned, he was flushed from the run, wiping sweat from his brow as he grabbed a glass of water. "Good route today," he said, his voice casual. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Glad you enjoyed it." The folded paper was nowhere in sight. Over the next few days, I began noticing other cracks in the routine. His phone, always face down on the counter. An unfamiliar cologne lingering on his jacket. Receipts for cafes I'd never heard of tucked into his wallet. But it was the window that broke me. It happened again on a Saturday. I'd closed it the night before, checked the latch twice to be sure. Yet there it was in the morning, open just enough to let the wind stir the curtains. This time, I searched the room. I combed through drawers, lifted cushions, even checked the space under the bed. And that's when I found it. A small, leather-bound journal, tucked beneath the mattress on his side. I opened it with shaking hands, flipping through pages filled with dates, times, and brief entries. Monday, 6:30, same place. Her smile still catches me off guard. Thursday, shared tea this time. She always chooses jasmine. Saturday, can't keep this up much longer. Don't know what I'm waiting for. I slammed the journal shut, my breath catching in my throat. The entries weren't long, but each one felt like a dagger, carving out pieces of the life I thought we shared. When he came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room. The journal sat on the coffee table between us, its leather cover smooth and unassuming. He froze in the doorway, his eyes darting to the book, then back to me. "You left the window open again," I said, my voice calm. He didn't respond. "Why don't you tell me about her?" He sat down slowly, his movements heavy. For a long moment, he said nothing, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Finally, he sighed. "Her name is Elise." The name landed like a stone in the room, sinking into the silence. "We met at a conference," he continued, his voice low. "It was unintentional. We started talking, and it just kept going." I nodded. the weight of his words pressing against my chest. How long? 6 months. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. Do you love her? He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. The honesty in his voice was worse than a lie. I stood, picking up the journal and holding it out to him. Take this, and take whatever else you need. But you can't stay here. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with something that might have been regret. I didn't want it to end like this, he said. Neither did I. That night, the house was quiet. The window stayed closed. Weeks later, I drove past the brick house with the ivy. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, but as I glanced at the door, I thought I saw her standing there, a folded piece of paper in her hands. When I got home, I opened the window wide and let the breeze fill the room. Some spaces are meant to be cleared, to let something new take root. It was the kind of road you only find by accident. I hadn't meant to take the turn. The main highway was supposed to be a straight shot, but my GPS had glitched, rerouting me down a winding back road lined with ancient trees. Their branches arched overhead like a tunnel, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler here, damp and still, and the pavement beneath my tires seemed older, cracked and uneven. I told myself I'd turn around at the next intersection, but the road just kept going, bending endlessly like a coiled snake. There were no signs, no mile markers, no landmarks, just the trees pressing closer with every curve. And then I saw the gas station. It appeared out of nowhere, a low, squat building with peeling white paint and a flickering neon sign that read, Open. There was no brand name, no logos, just 2 rusty pumps and a cracked asphalt lot littered with cigarette butts and old receipts. A part of me wanted to keep driving, but my gas gauge was low, dangerously low, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car. I pulled in. The moment I opened the door, the smell hit me. A mix of gasoline, mildew, and something faintly metallic. The inside was dimly lit, with shelves of dusty snacks and faded magazines that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A single clerk stood behind the counter, his back turned to me. He was tall and thin, his skin pale enough to seem almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent light. Hello? I called, trying to sound casual. The man turned slowly, his movements unnaturally fluid. His face was sharp, almost skeletal, with eyes that were just a shade too dark, like ink pooling in sockets. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, his lips curling into a faint, almost knowing smile. Just need to fill up, I said, holding up my wallet as if to reassure him. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. Pump 2 works, he said. His voice was smooth, but there was an undercurrent to it, something that set my nerves on edge, like a barely audible hum just beneath his words. I nodded, backing out of the store and nearly tripping over the threshold. Outside, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the world beyond the gas station had decided to hold its breath. The pump groaned when I lifted the nozzle, the numbers on the ancient display spinning too fast to be accurate. I glanced back toward the store. The clerk was still watching me through the grimy window, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if studying me. The tank clicked full, and I fumbled to replace the nozzle. When I turned back to my car, my heart stopped. There was something in the trees. Just beyond the edge of the lot, where the shadows were deepest, a figure stood motionless. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a darker patch of shadow among the others. But then it shifted, just slightly, and I saw the outline of a face. Or at least, what should have been a face. It was featureless, smooth and pale like a mannequin's, but it was looking at me. I could feel it. I jumped into the car, slamming the door and locking it in one panicked motion. My hands shook as I started the engine, the sound breaking the oppressive silence. When I glanced back toward the store, the clerk was gone. I didn't wait. The tires screeched as I pulled out onto the road, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees seemed to close in even tighter, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. I drove for what felt like hours, but the road never changed. No turns, no intersections, just the same endless stretch of cracked pavement. My headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the world beyond the trees was a void, empty and impenetrable. Then I saw the gas station again. At first, I thought it was a different station, maybe part of a strange loop of rural outposts. But as I pulled closer, I realized it was the same one. The same peeling paint, the same flickering sign, the same cracked asphalt lot, the same clerk, standing outside, smiling. "No," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "No, no, no." The clerk raised a hand, beckoning me. Behind him, in the trees, the shadowy figure had multiplied. There were dozens now, standing just at the edge of the lot, their blank faces turned toward me in silent anticipation. I slammed on the gas, swerving past the station and back onto the road. The car roared, the speedometer climbing higher than I thought it could. The trees blurred, and the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against the car like a living thing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the road ended. The car skidded to a stop in front of a dead-end sign, the pavement crumbling into dirt and gravel. Beyond it was nothing but forest, dense and dark. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the gas station was there. Closer this time. The clerk was standing in the middle of the road, his smile impossibly wide, and the shadows had followed. They surrounded the car, their pale faces pressing against the windows, featureless and smooth. I screamed, throwing the car into reverse, but the tires spun uselessly in the loose gravel. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was the clerk, leaning down to the driver's side window. His face was inches from mine, his black eyes filled with something that wasn't human. "You're not lost," he said, his voice like a whisper in my mind. "You're found." When I woke up, I was in my bed. My car was parked neatly outside, and the world seemed normal. But every night since, when I close my eyes, I see the gas station, and the shadows are getting closer. It was the mannequin in the thrift store that caught my eye. I wasn't there to shop for clothes. I needed furniture. My new apartment was an echo chamber of bare walls and empty floors, and I figured a thrift store would be a good place to pick up some basics on the cheap. The mannequin wasn't even for sale. It stood in the corner, posed with one plastic hand on its hip and the other hanging at its side. Its face wasn't detailed, just a smooth, featureless oval that somehow gave the impression of watching you. The clothes it wore, a faded red dress and scuffed black heels, looked decades old, the kind of thing no one had worn unironically since the 80s. I wouldn't have given it more than a passing glance if it hadn't been for the price tag pinned to the dress. It was handwritten, just a single word scrawled in messy, looping letters, "Mine." Something about it gave me pause. Does the mannequin come with the dress? I asked the clerk, more as a joke than anything. The clerk, an older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, looked up sharply. "That's not for sale," she said. Her tone was brisk, almost defensive. I nodded, feeling foolish for asking, and moved on to the furniture section. But as I browsed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I glanced back toward the mannequin, it was still there, standing exactly as it had before. At least, I thought it was. I was almost certain its head had turned slightly, angling toward me. I laughed it off, nerves, overactive imagination, but I paid for my things and left quickly, the back of my neck prickling the entire time. That night, as I was unpacking, I noticed something strange. The box of items I'd bought at the thrift store included a small, framed mirror that I didn't remember picking up. It wasn't on the receipt, either. Just a simple oval with a tarnished brass frame. Old enough to look antique, but not valuable. I assumed the clerk had accidentally included it and decided to keep it. I hung it on the wall above my dresser, thinking nothing of it. But when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I felt that same uneasy prickling at the base of my skull. It wasn't the mirror itself. It was what was behind me. In the faint, distorted reflection, I could see a figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. It was tall, dressed in red, with a blank, featureless face. I turned sharply, my heart racing. The corner was empty. I laughed nervously, told myself it was just a trick of the light, and went to bed. The first knock came at 2:34 a.m. It wasn't loud, Just a soft tap 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 against the window. I sat up, heart pounding, and stared at the glass. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was nothing there. I tried to go back to sleep, but the tapping came again, more insistent this time. When I got up to check, the window was still empty. The street below was deserted, the only movement coming from the faint sway of the streetlights in the breeze. But when I turned back to bed, I saw it. The mirror was fogged over, as though someone had been breathing on it. And in the condensation, a single word was written: mine. I tore the mirror off the wall and threw it into the closet, slamming the door shut. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, every light in the apartment blazing. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe a prank from someone at the thrift store. It had to be explainable. I didn't look at the mirror when I got dressed, but as I headed out the door, I stopped in my tracks. There, propped against the wall in the hallway, was the mannequin. Its head was tilted, as though watching me leave. I ran. I called the thrift store that afternoon, hoping for some kind of explanation. The woman who answered the phone sounded impatient when I asked about the mannequin. "I told you," she said. "It's not for sale." "I didn't buy it," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's here." There was a long pause. "You need to bring it back," she said finally, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Now, tonight." I started to ask why, but she hung up. When I got home, the mannequin wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was in my bedroom. It stood in the middle of the room, one hand outstretched, as though waiting for me to take it. The closet door was open, the mirror leaning against the wall. The word "mine" was etched deep into the glass, scratched over and over again until the surface was nearly opaque. I didn't stay long enough to figure out how it had gotten there. I grabbed the mannequin, shoved it into the back seat of my car, and drove to the thrift store as fast as I could. The lights inside were off, the windows dark. I banged on the door, shouting for someone to let me in. Finally, the clerk appeared, her face pale and drawn. "Take it," I said, pushing the mannequin toward her. She didn't touch it. "It's yours now," she whispered. The mannequin's head turned toward me, its featureless face somehow filled with malice. And then I heard the knocking again, soft, deliberate, coming from inside the car. The email came at 3:03 a.m. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't been awake, lying in bed and staring at the glow of my phone. Insomnia had a way of making you check emails at hours when the world was supposed to be silent. The subject line read, "Are you still there?" No sender name, no address. The body of the email was short and strange. "We miss you. Please come back. You know the way." Beneath the message was an attachment titled "Return.path." I stared at the screen, half convinced I was dreaming. Something about it felt off. Not threatening exactly, but wrong in a way that made my chest tighten. I didn't open the attachment, though my thumb hovered over it longer than I'd like to admit. Instead, I deleted the email and powered off my phone. The next morning, the email was back. Same subject line, same text, same attachment. My chest tightened when I saw it. No one had my email address except a few close friends and work contacts, and the sender's address still wasn't visible. This time, I didn't delete it. I took screenshots and forwarded them to a friend who worked in IT, asking if it could be some kind of phishing scam. She responded a few hours later, "No malware attached." But that's weird. It doesn't show up in the logs like it ever reached your inbox. Are you sure it wasn't already on your device? That wasn't possible. That night, I dreamed of a path. It was narrow and winding, cutting through a forest of trees so tall they seemed to blot out the sky. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. There were no stars, no moon, just the faint glow of something in the distance, pulling me forward. I woke up gasping, my skin slick with sweat. The email was waiting for me again, identical to the others. This time, I opened the attachment. The screen went black for a moment, and then an image appeared, a map, but not one I recognized. The lines were jagged and uneven, like they'd been drawn in haste, and the landmarks were labeled with strange, nonsensical names. The place where shadows touch, the mirror tree, the river that remembers. At the bottom of the map was a note in the same font as the email. "You were here once. Find your way back." My breath caught. There was something eerily familiar about the map, though I couldn't explain why. The rest of the day felt surreal. At work, my mind kept drifting back to the map, the strange landmarks etched into my memory as if they'd always been there. By the time I got home, I decided I needed to know more. I printed the map and laid it on my kitchen table, tracing the paths with my fingers. It didn't align with any real-world locations I could think of, but something deep inside told me it was real. The first landmark, the place where shadows touch, was marked with a small circle. The line leading to it twisted and looped like a trail drawn by someone who had walked it blindfolded. I don't know why I left the house that night. The map didn't include any instructions, no address or coordinates, but my legs carried me out the door like I'd been following its directions my whole life. The streets were quiet, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights, but the air felt heavy, as though the night itself was watching. I turned down an alley I didn't recognize. At the end of it was a gate I was certain hadn't been there before. It was tall and rusted, the kind of thing that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Beyond it was a narrow path cutting through dense trees. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. It was the path from my dream. I hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. The gate creaked open under my hand, and the world beyond felt colder, sharper, as though I'd stepped into another place entirely. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees pressing closer together with every step. Their branches formed an arch overhead, blocking out the faint light of the stars. I didn't need the map to know where to go. The route was etched into me, a memory I couldn't explain. I reached the first landmark within minutes. The place where shadows touch wasn't a clearing or a structure. It was a feeling. The air grew still, the silence pressing against my ears like cotton. The shadows of the trees stretched unnaturally, merging into a single, undulating shape that seemed to breathe. As I stepped closer, a voice whispered through the stillness, low and resonant. "You remember now?" The words weren't a question. I didn't answer. The shadows coiled and pulsed, retreating into the forest as though satisfied. The map had a second destination, the mirror tree. The path was narrower now, the underbrush clawing at my ankles as I walked. I passed no animals, heard no rustling leaves or distant calls. Only the sound of my own breathing, steady and shallow. The tree came into view suddenly, its silvery bark glinting in the darkness. Its surface was smooth, polished like glass, and as I approached, my reflection appeared in its trunk. But it wasn't me. The figure staring back at me had my face, but their expression was wrong, too calm, too knowing. They raised a hand, and I realized they weren't mirroring me. They were moving of their own accord. "You left us here," they said, their voice hollow and distant. "Do you remember why?" "I don't know what this is," I whispered. The reflection tilted its head, their smile sharp. "You will." The trunk of the tree split open, revealing a hollow space filled with swirling light. The air shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and something metallic. The pull was stronger now, an invisible force dragging me forward. I reached for the light, my fingers brushing the edge of the hollow, and I was back in my apartment. The map was gone, the email was gone, but the feeling remains. I don't dream of the path anymore. I don't need to. Sometimes, when I walk through the city, I catch glimpses of places that don't belong. A street that twists too far, a doorway that wasn't there yesterday. And in the stillness of the night, I hear the voice again. "You will remember." The first time I saw the ladder, it was leaning against the building across from my apartment. I wouldn't have thought twice about it. Maintenance workers, painters, the usual explanations. But it was late, nearly midnight, and the ladder stretched higher than seemed possible. It reached up past the second floor, the third, and even the fourth, disappearing into the shadows above, where the streetlights couldn't reach. I watched it for a while from my window, half expecting someone to climb it, but no one appeared. The street below was empty except for the faint hum of a passing car and the occasional flicker of a moth against the street lamp. After a while, I told myself it wasn't my concern. Just an oddity, something to mention offhandedly to a coworker the next day. But when I woke the next morning, the ladder was gone. There were no scuff marks on the pavement, no signs that it had ever been there. I looked around for a work truck or scaffolding, anything to explain it, but the street was as unremarkable as ever. I forgot about the ladder after a few days. Life moved on. Work, errands, the endless loop of small responsibilities that blurred the days together. It wasn't until a week later, when I saw it again, that the unease returned. This time, the ladder was leaning against my building. I spotted it late at night as I was brushing my teeth, the window fogged from the steam of a hot shower. It stood against the brick facade, just a few feet from my own window, its rungs stretching upward into the inky darkness. My heart raced as I stared at it, the toothbrush dangling from my hand. I leaned closer to the glass, searching for movement, for some sign of who had put it there. The thought of someone climbing up, peering into my apartment, made my skin crawl. But again, the street below was empty, and the ladder remained still. I closed the blinds, double-checked the locks on my windows and doors, and told myself it was just a coincidence. Some worker had forgotten to remove it, or maybe it was part of some maintenance I hadn't been informed about. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The ladder wasn't gone the next morning. It had moved. Now, it leaned against the fire escape at the far end of the building, angled toward the roof. I stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at my skin, and walked toward it. Up close, the ladder was taller than it had seemed from my window, its metal rungs tarnished and slightly warped. There was something strange about the way it leaned, not quite flush against the building, as though it were balanced precariously. I reached out to touch it, but a sudden, sharp noise, a clang of metal from above, made me jerk my hand back. I craned my neck, peering up toward the roof, but there was nothing there, just an empty stretch of gray sky. That night, I dreamed of the ladder. In the dream, it wasn't leaning against the building. It was standing upright in the middle of the street, its base rooted in the asphalt like the trunk of a tree. The rungs seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward into a sky that was darker than any night I'd ever seen. I climbed it. I don't know why. In the dream, it felt like the only thing I could do. My hands gripped the cold metal, my feet moving steadily upward, step after step, until the ground below was nothing more than a memory. The higher I climbed, the more the air changed. It grew heavier, thicker, until it pressed against my lungs and blurred my vision. And then, I heard it, a voice, low and distant, calling my name. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The air in my apartment felt too thin, too sharp, and I stumbled to the window, yanking the blinds open. The ladder was gone. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the dream. It clung to me like a second skin, its details too vivid to dismiss. I found myself scanning the street whenever I left the apartment, my eyes darting toward rooftops and alleys, searching for any sign of the ladder. And then it came back. This time, it wasn't leaning against a building. It was in the alley behind the grocery store, standing upright like it had in my dream. The same impossibly tall structure, its rungs disappearing into the darkening sky. I stood there, staring at it, my breath clouding in the cold evening air. A part of me wanted to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, deeper, quieter, more insistent, pulled me toward it. My feet moved before I could stop them, carrying me closer. The metal was cold under my hands, the rungs slightly slick with moisture. As I placed my foot on the first step, a jolt of fear shot through me, but I didn't stop. The climb was steady, the air around me growing colder with each step. The noise of the city faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that wrapped around me like a shroud. I don't know how long I climbed. Minutes, hours. Time felt stretched, distorted. And then, I saw it. A figure. It stood a few rungs above me, its form barely visible in the faint light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that made my stomach churn. It didn't move. I froze, my hands gripping the ladder so tightly my knuckles ached. The figure tilted its head, as though noticing me for the first time. And then it began to climb, downward, toward me. Its movements were slow, deliberate, the sound of its hands and feet on the rungs echoing in the silence. Panic surged through me, and I began to climb down, my feet slipping on the slick metal, The ladder swayed slightly, and for one horrifying moment, I thought it would fall. The figure was closer now, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it descended. I don't remember reaching the ground. When I looked up, the ladder was gone. I left the city the next day, driving without a destination, without looking back. But the ladder found me again. It always does. There's an alley in my neighborhood that shouldn't exist. It's not on any map, and no matter how many times I walk past it during the day, it's never there. Just a solid stretch of brick between a boarded-up hardware store and an old laundromat. But at night, the alley appears. I found it by accident one evening while walking home late from a friend's party. The street was unusually quiet, the kind of eerie stillness that makes you check over your shoulder without knowing why. I turned the corner, and there it was, narrow and dark, stretching farther than seemed possible. I stopped. It wasn't the alley itself that made me hesitate, but the feeling. The air seemed heavier there, colder, as though the warmth from the streetlights couldn't quite reach it. My stomach churned with an unnameable instinct, a warning. But curiosity pulled me forward. The entrance was marked by two faint, flickering lights, casting long, inconsistent shadows along the brick walls. The ground was damp, though it hadn't rained in days, and the smell, earthy, metallic, wrong, filled my nose as I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the graffiti. It wasn't the usual mess of tags and spray-painted obscenities. These were symbols, intricate, interwoven, like something ancient carved by a hand that wasn't quite human. They covered the walls, winding up toward the rooftops, shifting and shimmering faintly as if alive. The second thing was the noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind funneling through the narrow space. But as I moved deeper into the alley, I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was a low hum, layered with whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but they filled my head with a strange, urgent rhythm that made my skin prickle. About 20 steps in, I stopped. The alley stretched far longer than it should have, extending beyond what the layout of the neighborhood could possibly allow. I glanced back, expecting to see the street and its familiar lights. But the entrance was gone. Behind me was nothing but more alley, stretching endlessly in both directions. My heart raced, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. Panic wouldn't help. I had to think. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. No matter how many times I pressed the button, it stayed dark, reflecting only the faint glimmer of the strange symbols behind me. The whispers grew louder. I turned back toward the path ahead. Something flickered in the distance, a faint glow, pale and wavering, like a lantern swaying in the dark. With nowhere else to go, I moved toward it. As I walked, the alley began to change. The bricks underfoot became uneven, cracked, as though they hadn't been touched in decades. The symbols on the walls grew larger, more elaborate, twisting together into shapes that seemed almost organic. I could swear they were watching me. And then I heard it. A scrape. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I stopped, straining my ears. The scrape came again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The scrape stopped. A soft laugh echoed in response. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was fractured, broken, as though it came from multiple throats at once, all out of sync. The sound wrapped around me, pushing me forward toward the glow. I reached it after what felt like hours. The light came from an old-fashioned street lamp, its base cracked and rusted. Beneath it stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a man, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its skin shimmered like the symbols on the walls. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel its attention, a weight pressing against my chest. "Why are you here?" it asked. The voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space, resonating in my bones. I don't know," I stammered. "I was just walking and—" "You shouldn't have come," it said, cutting me off. "I didn't mean to," I said quickly. "I'll leave. There's no leaving," it said, stepping closer. I backed away, my heart hammering. The whispers around me turned into a cacophony, rising and falling in waves. each word blending into the next. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head further, its neck bending at an impossible angle. "A doorway," it said. "To what?" It didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, or what I thought was a hand. The limb was long and thin, its surface rippling like liquid, and as it moved, the symbols on the walls pulsed in unison. "Look behind you," it said. I didn't want to, but something in its tone made it impossible to resist. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The alley wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood in the shadows, dozens of them, their forms shifting and flickering like candlelight. They didn't move toward me, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "What do you want?" I whispered. The figure under the street lamp stepped closer, its face, or the absence of one, mere inches from mine. "You already gave it to us," it said. Before I could respond, the light from the lamp flared, blinding me. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the street. The alley was gone. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, and looked around. Everything was normal, the streetlights, the quiet hum of traffic in the distance. But my hands were shaking. When I got home, I went straight to the bathroom to splash water on my face. As I reached for the faucet, I froze. The symbols were on my arm, faint and glowing, winding up toward my shoulder. And in the silence of my apartment, I could still hear the whispers. I never thought much about the alley behind my apartment. It was the kind of place you avoided without needing a reason. A gap between two old buildings filled with dumpsters, broken glass, and the faint smell of rot. My building had a front entrance, clean and well-lit, and I'd always used that. But one night, after staying late at work, I came home to find the main entrance cordoned off with caution tape. "Water damage," the super said, waving me off with a flashlight. "Use the alley. Back doors unlocked." The alley was darker than I expected. The streetlight at the far end flickered weakly, and the shadows between the buildings felt unnaturally deep. I hesitated, considering whether I should just go crash at a friend's place. But the thought of walking 10 more blocks in the cold pushed me forward. I kept my head down and walked quickly, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. Halfway through, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against stone. I stopped, my heart pounding, and scanned the darkness. There was nothing there. No movement, no figures, just the vague outline of dumpsters and the glint of shattered glass catching the weak light. I told myself it was nothing, probably a rat, or maybe just the wind stirring the garbage. But as I reached the back door to my building, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A whisper. It wasn't a word, not exactly. More like a sigh that stretched too long, curling into a sound that almost became language. My fingers fumbled with the handle, and when the door finally opened, I slipped inside and slammed it shut behind me, the sound echoing down the stairwell. My apartment felt colder than usual, but I chalked it up to the old heating system struggling against the night. I tried to shake off the unease as I locked the door and made tea, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an alley. Dark places played tricks on your mind. That was all. The dream started that night. In the dream, I was back in the alley. The walls were taller than before, stretching upward into darkness, and the dumpsters were gone, replaced by jagged rocks that jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft, almost spongy. I heard the whisper again, louder this time. It came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around me like a cold wind. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the rocks, a figure, pale and thin, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. I woke up gasping, the sound of my alarm clock dragging me back to reality. The apartment felt even colder than before, and the windows were fogged up despite being shut tightly. The day passed uneventfully, but the dream lingered. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, glinting faintly in the darkness. That evening, as I came home, I found myself hesitating at the mouth of the alley. The caution tape was still up at the front entrance, and the super waved me off again, mumbling about structural damage. The alley looked the same as it had the night before, but now it felt different. Heavier, somehow, as though the air itself were pressing down on me. I told myself I was being ridiculous and forced myself to walk forward, my footsteps echoing off the walls. This time, the whisper came earlier. I hadn't even reached the halfway point when I heard it, a soft, drawn-out sigh that seemed to vibrate in the air around me. I stopped, frozen in place, and strained to listen. The sound shifted, becoming something closer to a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, threading itself into the spaces between my thoughts. It spoke a single word, soft and low, closer. I turned and ran, my breath coming in sharp bursts as I stumbled out of the alley and onto the main street. People turned to look at me, their faces etched with mild concern, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. That night, I dreamt of the figure again. This time, it was clearer. Its limbs were long and impossibly thin, its fingers stretching outward like twisted branches. Its face, or what passed for a face, was smooth and pale, with no features except for two black hollows where eyes should have been. It didn't move, but I felt it watching me, its presence pressing against my chest like a physical weight. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. Closer. When I woke, there was something in the corner of my room. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the streetlight outside, a trick of the dim light spilling through the blinds. But as I sat up, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was darker than the rest of the room, its edges sharp and distinct. It didn't move, but I felt it watching me. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I tried to convince myself I was losing it. Stress, lack of sleep, overwork, it had to be something like that. But the thought of walking through the alley again made my skin crawl. When I got home that evening, I found a note taped to the caution tape at the front entrance. The handwriting was neat and precise, each letter perfectly formed. Take the alley. I tore it down and threw it into the nearest trash can, my hands shaking. That night, the dream was worse. The figure was closer now, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as it reached for me. Its hands were impossibly large, the fingers bending in ways that made my stomach turn. When I woke, there were scratches on the inside of my bedroom door. I didn't go to work the next day. I stayed in the apartment, every light turned on, every door and window locked. But the whispers didn't care about locks. They came anyway, threading through the walls, the floor, the very air. By nightfall, the scratching started. It wasn't loud, just a faint, deliberate sound, like nails dragging against wood. It came from the hallway first, then the ceiling, then the floor beneath my bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found another note, this time on my kitchen counter. Closer. I don't remember leaving the apartment that day, but somehow I ended up back at the mouth of the alley. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should have. The air was thick and cold, and the whisper was waiting for me. It didn't come from a single direction now. It surrounded me, filling my head with that single word, closer. I stepped into the alley. The ground felt softer than it should have, the walls taller, the shadows darker. The whisper grew louder, threading itself into my thoughts until it was all I could hear. At the far end of the alley, the figure was waiting. Its limbs stretched outward, its face smooth and featureless, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. As I walked closer, it raised one hand, beckoning. The last thing I remember is the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, drowning out the whisper. Now, the alley is gone. Or maybe I'm the one who's gone. The call came just after midnight, cutting through the stillness of my apartment. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The screen showed no number, just a blank void where caller ID should have been. I let it ring, waiting for it to stop. When it didn't, I picked up, more annoyed than curious. Hello? There was no voice on the other end, just static. I listened for a moment, then started to hang up. But just as my thumb hovered over the button, I heard something, a faint whisper, buried beneath the white noise. It wasn't clear enough to understand, but it was there, rhythmic and deliberate. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, straining to make out the words, but the more I listened, the less sense it made. It felt like the sound was burrowing into my skull, wrapping itself around my thoughts. I hung up. The apartment felt colder than before, though I turned the heat up earlier. The corners of the room seemed darker, the shadows thicker, stretching further than they should. I told myself it was just a prank, but then the phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. The ringing stopped on its own after what felt like an eternity, leaving the room in heavy silence. I went to bed, the whisper still faintly echoing in my ears. The next morning, things were missing. Nothing major at first. A pin I always kept on my desk was gone, replaced by one I didn't recognize. A sleek, black pin with no branding, its surface unervingly smooth. My favorite coffee mug had vanished from the cupboard, and in its place was a thin porcelain cup I'd never seen before. I looked around the apartment, my pulse quickening. When I stepped into the bathroom, I froze. The mirror was empty. Not shattered, not fogged over. Just empty. It reflected the room behind me, the shower curtain, the counter, the open door. But my face wasn't there. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass, but there was nothing. Just the reflection of an empty room. The whisper returned. It wasn't coming from the phone this time. It was here, in the apartment, drifting through the air like smoke. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but the sound pressed against me, sinking into my skin. I backed away from the mirror, my chest tight. That evening, I found the first mark. It was on the living room wall, faint and jagged, like a scratch left by something with too many claws. The paint around it was darker, the edges curling inward as though the wall itself had been burned. I touched it cautiously, half expecting it to be warm, but it wasn't. It was cold. So cold it felt like ice, and when I pulled my hand away, the whisper grew louder. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the mark had spread. It wasn't just on the wall anymore. It was on the floor, the ceiling, the furniture. Thin, black lines spiderwebbing outward, curling and twisting in patterns that seemed deliberate, purposeful. They pulsed faintly when I looked at them, as though they were alive. I tried to leave the apartment, but the door wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked. It just wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled. The windows wouldn't open either, and the air inside felt heavier, thicker, like it was pushing back against me. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen was blank. Not black, just blank, an empty expanse of pale gray. No icons, no text, no light. Then the phone rang. I dropped it instinctively, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. The whisper poured out of the speaker, louder now, clearer, the words just barely audible. Let it in. The phone went silent. When I picked it up, the screen was gone. The phone was nothing but a cold, featureless block in my hand. The marks on the walls began to move. They slithered across the surface like living things, coiling and stretching toward the center of the room. The whisper grew louder, joined by a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floor. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, and then it appeared. It rose from the center of the room, unfolding itself in impossible ways. Its form was both massive and delicate, a silhouette of sharp angles and flowing curves that didn't belong in this world. The air around it shimmered, bending the light in unnatural patterns. It didn't have a face, but it turned toward me. The whisper stopped. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that drowns out everything else. Then it spoke. "You invited me," it said, though the words didn't come from its form. They came from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. I started, but my voice caught in my throat. "You answered." The marks on the walls pulsed, the black lines writhing as though in agreement. The thing moved closer, its form shifting and shimmering. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. It didn't answer. Instead, it reached toward me, its hand, or what could be called a hand, stretching outward. I felt the air around me tighten, pulling me forward. When its touch reached me, the world fractured. I woke up on the floor, the apartment silent and empty. The marks were gone. The phone was gone. The mirror reflected my face again. But the air felt wrong. The shadows stretched too far. And sometimes, when the room is quiet, I hear it. The whisper. It's still here. The cabin wasn't supposed to be there. The map showed nothing but forest for miles, and yet, there it was, a squat structure barely visible through the trees, its roof sagging under a blanket of moss. I'd been hiking the trail for 3 hours, trying to shake off a breakup and clear my head, when I saw it, a silhouette just off the path. Something about the cabin felt misplaced, like it had been dropped there by mistake. The trees around it were older than anything I'd seen in the forest, their trunks gnarled and split like mouths frozen mid-scream. The dirt leading to the cabin was undisturbed. No footprints, no tire tracks. Yet the cabin looked worn, as though it had stood there for decades. I told myself to walk on. Instead, I veered off the trail. The closer I got, the worse the air became. It carried a damp, metallic smell, faint but insistent, like rusted metal left too long in the rain. The door to the cabin was ajar. I leaned in, peering through the crack. The interior was dark, but not completely. There was a faint, pulsing light coming from somewhere deeper inside, like a flicker of a candle. I should have turned back, but my legs moved on their own, curiosity overriding the warnings in my chest. Inside, the air was thicker, heavier. The walls were bare wood, carved with strange, uneven marks that didn't form letters or symbols but felt deliberate. The faint light came from a room at the back of the cabin, spilling out in irregular bursts, as though the source was struggling to stay alive. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved, and the smell grew stronger with every step. In the room, I found the table. It was the only piece of furniture in the cabin, its surface scarred and dark, surrounded by a ring of 5 chairs. Each chair faced inward, the wood polished to a high sheen, as though someone had sat there recently. And on the table was the box. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and covered in a layer of soot so thick it looked almost velvet. The light was coming from the seams of the box. A faint hum filled the room, so low it felt more like a vibration in my chest than a sound. It seemed to come from the box, though the way it resonated through the air made it impossible to tell for sure. I reached out, hesitating as my fingers hovered over the lid. The wood was warm to the touch, almost alive. Something shifted behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The room had no windows, no other doors, yet I could feel it. Something watching. The air grew colder, and the hum became sharper, more insistent, like it was reacting to my presence. I spun around. There was nothing there, but the shadows in the corners of the room were wrong. They pressed closer, bleeding into the light spilling from the box. The hum became a whisper. At first, I couldn't make out the words. They were faint, overlapping, as though several voices were speaking at once. But as I leaned closer to the box, the whispers grew clearer. "Take it." I backed away, my pulse thudding in my ears. The shadows moved. They weren't shadows anymore. Not entirely. They twisted and curled, reaching toward me, their edges rippling like ink spilled into water. The whispers turned to laughter. It wasn't human. I grabbed the box. The moment I lifted it, the cabin fell silent. The air lightened. The shadows stopped moving, and the whispering ceased. But the box was still warm in my hands. The light from the seams grew brighter, spilling through my fingers as though trying to escape. I shoved it into my backpack and bolted, the floorboards groaning beneath me as I ran. The forest outside felt different. The air was colder, the trees darker, their branches twisting like claws. I made it back to the trail and didn't stop running until I reached my car. By the time I got home, it was dark. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and placed the box on my kitchen table. I didn't want to open it, but the light was brighter now, spilling through the seams in sharp, blinding streaks. The hum returned, low and steady, vibrating through the floor. The box shifted. It wasn't much, just a faint movement, as though something inside was pushing against the lid. I didn't touch it. That night, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was soft at first, like fingernails against wood, but it grew louder, more insistent. The light from the box pulsed, casting long shadows across the room. The tapping became banging, and then I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, coming from inside the box. "Let me out." I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, the box was gone. but the marks it left on the table remained. 5 deep scratches, spaced evenly apart, like the fingers of a hand. And I still hear it. The whispering, the laughter, the voice. Let me out. The first sign that something was wrong with the apartment came on the 3rd night. I had just moved into a small place downtown, a studio with high ceilings, creaky floors, and a view of the fire escape. It wasn't much, but the rent was cheap, and after years of bouncing between roommates, I finally had a space of my own. The first 2 nights were unremarkable, filled with the usual chaos of unpacking and the faint unease of sleeping in a new place. But on the 3rd night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic tapping, like something soft brushing against the wall. My half-asleep brain chalked it up to the pipes, or maybe a draft rattling a loose window pane. I rolled over, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and drifted off again. By the next morning, I'd forgotten all about it. A week later, it was impossible to ignore. The tapping had become louder, more insistent. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, it always woke me up at the same time. 3:12 a.m. exactly. Each time, I would lie there in the dark, holding my breath, straining to pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from the wall next to my bed, a faint thudding like knuckles lightly rapping on wood. I knocked back once, out of desperation and a little defiance. The sound stopped immediately, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. I told myself it was the neighbor. The building was old, the walls thin. Someone on the other side probably had a strange habit. Maybe it was a pipe expanding. Old buildings are noisy, right? But then, one night, the tapping moved. I had fallen asleep on the couch, an open book splayed across my chest. When I woke, the clock on the stove read 3:12 a.m., and the tapping was there again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from inside the closet. I sat up, my heart hammering, the sound of my pulse loud in my ears. The tapping was softer now, more like scratching, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the closet door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When the first pale light of dawn filtered through the window, I finally mustered the courage to check. The closet was empty, just rows of neatly hung clothes and a few cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. But the smell was new. It was faint, metallic, like rust or blood, lingering in the air long after I shut the door. I didn't sleep the next night, or the one after that. The tapping continued, sometimes at the wall, sometimes in the closet. Each time, it grew a little louder, a little closer, until I started hearing it during the day, too. At first, it was faint, buried under the hum of the fridge or the chatter of people on the street below. But soon, it became unmistakable, a steady rhythm that followed me from room to room. I called the landlord. He shrugged it off. "These old buildings," he said, leaning casually against the door frame. "They're full of quirks. Creaky floors, noisy pipes. You get used to it." When I mentioned the closet, he frowned. "No one's lived here in years," he said. "Not since the last guy." He trailed off, avoiding my gaze. "What happened to the last guy?" I asked, my throat tight. "Died," the landlord said after a long pause. "Heart attack, I think. Found him in the closet." I didn't ask any more questions. That night, I barricaded the closet door with a chair, the legs braced against the handle. It made me feel a little better, though the tapping continued as usual. But when I woke up, the chair was on the other side of the room. I don't remember moving it. The closet door was open, just a crack. Something was wrong with the apartment, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But when I opened it, the hallway outside was different. It stretched out endlessly, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. The walls were smeared with dark streaks, and the air was thick, oppressive, carrying that same metallic tang. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, and turned back to the apartment. The closet door was wide open, and for the first time, I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow, slinking out from the darkness beyond the doorway. But as it moved, It took shape: long, spindly limbs, a hunched, contorted frame. Its skin was pale and translucent, stretched taut over a body that looked wrong, like it had been put together in a hurry. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, just a smooth, blank surface with no eyes, no mouth. It tilted its head, as if listening, and then stepped toward me. I ran. I bolted for the window, throwing it open and clambering out onto the fire escape. Below me, the city looked normal. People walking, cars honking, life going on as if nothing was wrong. But when I looked back, the apartment wasn't there. The fire escape ended abruptly, dropping into empty space. Beyond it was darkness, thick, impenetrable, and alive with faint whispers. The thing in the apartment was watching me from the window. I don't remember how I got down. All I know is that I woke up in my car, parked 2 blocks away. The apartment is still there, but I haven't gone back. Sometimes, though, I hear it. The tapping. Soft, persistent, and getting closer. The box was left on my doorstep one gray November morning. No return address, no postage. Just a plain cardboard container sealed with crisp black tape. The edges so perfectly aligned it looked almost deliberate. I stood there for a moment, staring down at it, the wind biting at my skin. I hadn't ordered anything, and I didn't have the kind of friends who left surprise gifts. Curiosity outweighed caution, as it always did with me. I carried it inside, setting it down on the kitchen table. It wasn't heavy, but it had a density to it, as though whatever was inside was tightly packed. The tape peeled away cleanly under my fingers, and when I opened the flaps, I found a single object wrapped in faded cloth. Unwrapping it, I revealed a mirror. It was small, no larger than a paperback book, with an ornate brass frame tarnished to a dull green. The glass was murky, its surface speckled with age. I could barely make out my reflection, but something about it caught me, a feeling I couldn't quite name, like looking at an old photograph of a place you'd never been but still recognized. There was a note folded beneath the mirror, written on heavy parchment in an elegant, looping script. To see what you cannot forget, hold it at midnight. I laughed nervously, more at myself than at the note. Midnight? What was this, a prank? A poorly conceived marketing stunt? Still, there was something about the mirror that rooted me in place. Its weight felt heavier than it should, and its brass frame was cold enough to make my skin sting. That night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, I found myself unable to ignore the note's instruction. The mirror sat on my desk, catching the dim light from the lamp. I hesitated before picking it up, holding it carefully in both hands. The glass was clearer now than it had been earlier, as though it had been waiting for me. The moment the clock struck 12, the room changed. The air grew thick, the kind of suffocating stillness that comes before a storm. The mirror's surface began to ripple, faintly at first, then more violently, as though it were liquid rather than glass. I watched, mesmerized, as an image began to form. Faint shapes that sharpened with each passing second. It wasn't my reflection. The scene in the mirror was a room, but not mine. It was small and dimly lit. The walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of books. A desk sat in the center, papers strewn across its surface. The air inside it felt oppressive, even through the glass. At first, it was empty. Then a figure appeared. It was me. Not exactly me, but close enough to make my stomach twist. The figure sat at the desk, head bowed over the papers, its movements jerky, almost frantic. It scribbled furiously, pausing only to rip out pages and toss them aside. The more I stared, the more wrong it felt. Not because of the movements, but because of the light. The room was illuminated by a single lamp, yet the shadows didn't behave as they should. They twisted and stretched unnaturally, creeping across the walls like living things. I wanted to put the mirror down, to break it, to stop whatever I was seeing. But I couldn't. My hands wouldn't move. The figure in the mirror froze, its head snapping up. Its eyes met mine through the glass, and my breath caught in my throat. They weren't my eyes. They were too bright, too sharp, reflecting something I couldn't name. It stared at me for a long moment, then stood. My hands trembled as the figure began to walk toward the mirror, each step deliberate, predatory. The The room around it seemed to warp as it moved, the books melting into the walls, the shadows stretching toward the glass like fingers. I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked on its face. The closer it got, the more it began to shift, its features sliding into something unfamiliar and jagged. When it reached the edge of the mirror, it raised a hand and placed it against the glass. The surface rippled again, and I felt the cold seep through, numbing my fingers. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then it smiled, a grin that stretched too wide, its teeth jagged and uneven. And then it spoke, not from the mirror, but from the room behind me. "You remember, don't you?" I dropped the mirror. It hit the desk with a dull thud, the image vanishing instantly. I spun around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. The air still felt heavy, oppressive, but there was nothing there. The mirror was quiet for the rest of the night. But the next morning, there was another note on the desk. "To see what you cannot escape, hold it again." I didn't want to touch it. I wanted to throw it away, to bury it, to burn it. But when I picked it up to hurl it into the trash, the glass flared to life. This time, the scene was different. It was my living room, my bookshelves, my couch. But there was someone standing in the corner, their face obscured by shadow. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence filled the room, tangible even through the glass. And then I realized something that turned my stomach to ice. The reflection wasn't of the room as it was now. It was the room as it would be later, when the sun went down, when the light faded and the shadows crept in. The figure was waiting. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to go to work, to run errands, to do anything that might ground me. But the image in the mirror stayed with me, vivid and unshakable. When I returned home that evening, the house felt colder, darker, as though something had seeped in while I was away. I couldn't bring myself to touch the mirror again, but as the hours ticked by, the weight of its presence grew unbearable. At 11:59, I picked it up, my hands trembling. The glass was cold against my skin, colder than it should have been. At midnight, the image returned. This time, the figure wasn't waiting in the corner. It was standing right behind me. When I turned, the room was empty, but the reflection in the mirror didn't change. The figure was still there, its head tilted, its grin impossibly wide. It raised a hand, and I felt the pressure on my shoulder before I saw it. The last thing I remember is the glass cracking. I woke up the next morning to find the mirror gone. But the shadows in my house have never felt the same. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of glass breaking, and in the corner of my vision, I see something watching, waiting. The invitation arrived in an envelope of deep, blood-red paper, thick and almost waxy to the touch. No address, no stamp. It had simply appeared on my desk at work while I'd been away grabbing coffee. Inside, the message was brief. "You are cordially invited to a private showing. Tonight, 11:47 p.m. Observatory Theater. One guest only." There was no RSVP, no indication of who had sent it, just a strange, swirling insignia pressed into the corner of the card. A design of intertwining lines that seemed almost alive when I tilted it under the light. It wasn't a name I recognized, but the Observatory Theater sounded familiar, as though I'd heard it mentioned in passing somewhere. I should have tossed the card in the trash and moved on with my day, but something about it clung to me, its mystery buzzing faintly in my mind until it drowned out every other thought. At 11:30 p.m., I found myself standing outside a building that shouldn't exist. The Observatory Theater was nestled in a part of the city I thought I knew well, yet the street it stood on wasn't marked on any map. The structure was old, its ornate facade of stone and wrought iron illuminated by a flickering neon sign that simply read "Tonight" in looping, glowing script. The air felt different here. Thick, pressurized. The door opened before I could knock. An usher stood inside, dressed in a black suit that seemed almost too sharp, too precise, as though it had been cut to his exact dimensions in some otherworldly tailor's shop. His face was pale and strangely smooth, his features so symmetrical they seemed unreal. "Your ticket?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. I handed him the invitation, and his gloved hand brushed mine for a brief moment. His skin was ice cold. He nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The lobby was vast and empty, its polished marble floors reflecting the dim, golden light of a massive chandelier that seemed to hang from an impossibly high ceiling. The walls were lined with framed posters, but none of them bore any text or imagery I recognized. Just shapes and patterns, twisting in ways that made my eyes ache. The usher led me to the theater itself, a cavernous space filled with row upon row of plush red seats. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the front row, dead center. "Please enjoy the performance," the usher said, and his lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile before he disappeared into the shadows. I sat down, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The chair was too comfortable, its cushions swallowing me in a way that felt suffocating rather than luxurious. The lights dimmed, and the stage curtain lifted without warning. What I saw wasn't a performance. The stage was empty at first, but the air above it shimmered, bending and warping like heat rising off asphalt. Slowly, shapes began to emerge, faint outlines of people, translucent and flickering like static on an old TV. They were arguing. I couldn't hear them, but their movements were sharp, frantic, filled with a kind of desperation that made my chest tighten. Their outlines grew clearer as I watched, and I realized, with a creeping sense of dread, that one of them looked exactly like me. The figure moved with a familiarity I couldn't deny. The way it gestured with its hands, the slight tilt of its head. It wasn't just similar. It was me. I stood up, but the moment I did, the theater shifted. The rows of seats stretched outward, disappearing into a black void. The stage seemed to grow larger, its edges bleeding into the darkness until it consumed everything but the flickering figures. The other figures, the ones I didn't recognize, turned to look at me. Their faces were blurred, smudged like a painting ruined by rain, but their eyes burned with unsettling clarity. They didn't seem angry. They seemed expectant. "What is this?" I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the vastness. The figure that looked like me stepped forward, separating itself from the others. It pointed directly at me, its finger trembling slightly, and spoke in a voice that was too soft to hear but too sharp to ignore. "You shouldn't have come." The figures disappeared. The stage dissolved. I was standing in the lobby again, but it wasn't the same. The chandelier was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor. The posters on the walls had changed, their twisting patterns now replaced with images of myself in different moments of my life. Childhood birthdays, awkward teenage years, recent days at work. And in every photo, there was someone else. A tall figure, barely visible in the background, always watching. My chest tightened as the air around me seemed to pulse, the walls stretching and contracting as though the building itself were breathing. "Did you enjoy the show?" The usher's voice came from behind me. I turned, but he wasn't there. His voice echoed again, this time from somewhere deeper in the theater. "Your role isn't over." The double doors leading to the street slammed shut, and the lights went out. In the darkness, the faint shimmer of shapes began to form again, circling me like vultures. Their faces were clearer now, no longer smudged, and each one was someone I had known. Old friends, co-workers, people I hadn't thought about in years. They spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in a haunting symphony. "You've been watching for too long." A hand brushed my shoulder, cold, firm, and the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was my own face, staring back from the crowd. The next morning, I woke in my bed. The invitation was gone, but every time I pass a mirror, I see the theater reflected behind me, the curtain still drawn, waiting. I hadn't been back to my hometown in years, but the invitation was impossible to ignore. It arrived in the mail without a return address, written on thick, yellowed paper in a looping, elegant script I didn't recognize. "You are cordially invited to the centennial celebration of Black Hollow. Attendance is mandatory." No signature, no explanation. I stared at the letter for hours before folding it carefully and tucking it into my bag. I told myself I wasn't going. Black Hollow had been behind me for over a decade, buried under layers of distance and time. But as the days passed, the weight of the invitation pressed harder, a knot tightening in my chest every time I ignored it. When the day of the celebration arrived, I found myself packing a bag. The decision wasn't conscious. It felt as if something was guiding my hands, my body moving on instinct while my mind tried to rebel. The drive was longer than I remembered, the narrow road winding through miles of dense forest. Trees crowded the edges, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The sky seemed darker the closer I got, the light flattening into a dull gray that swallowed the horizon. When I reached the edge of town, I almost didn't recognize it. Black Hollow had always been small, a cluster of old houses and a single main street, but it seemed diminished. The buildings looked older than they should have, the paint peeling, the windows clouded with grime. The air was heavy with a faint metallic tang, and the streets were eerily quiet. No children playing, no distant hum of conversation, just silence. The town square, where the invitation instructed me to go, was as familiar as it was wrong. The old clock tower still stood at its center, its hands frozen at midnight. Tables and chairs were arranged in neat rows beneath strings of fraying lights that swayed gently in the still air. And then there were the people. I didn't recognize any of them, yet they all seemed to know me. They turned as I approached, their faces lighting up with strange, too wide smiles. Their clothes were outdated, mismatched pieces that looked as though they'd been pulled from a dozen different eras. "Welcome back," one of them said, a man with a threadbare suit and eyes that glittered like wet stones. "I wasn't planning to come," I said, my voice hesitant. "But you're here," he replied, his smile never faltering. "And that's what matters." I wanted to leave. My every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get in my car and drive until the forest and the town were nothing but a bad memory. But the crowd was pressing in now, guiding me toward a chair at the head of the largest table. I sat, my pulse pounding in my ears. The celebration began with a meal. Plates appeared as if by magic, piled high with food that smelled too rich, too sweet, too savory all at once. The townsfolk ate with fervor, their movements almost frantic, as though they hadn't eaten in years. But I couldn't bring myself to touch the food. The smell was overwhelming, cloying, and when I looked closer, I realized the dishes weren't quite right. The meat glistened too brightly, its texture wrong, like gelatinous silk. The bread crumbled in strange patterns, its insides threaded with something that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "You must be hungry," a woman beside me said. She was pale, her skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, her teeth too perfect when she smiled. "I'm fine," I said, pushing the plate away. She tilted her head, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before snapping back into place. "Suit yourself." The music started next. A band I hadn't noticed before began to play, their instruments old and battered, but producing a sound so beautiful it was almost painful. The crowd clapped and swayed, their movements increasingly erratic, their laughter too loud, too sharp. And then I saw him. Standing at the edge of the square, just beyond the glow of the lights, was a man I hadn't seen in years. His name caught in my throat, a memory I hadn't dared revisit. Caleb. He'd been my best friend when we were kids, the two of us inseparable until the day he vanished. No one had ever found him, and the town moved on, though I never did. Now he stood there, unchanged. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared. Same tousled hair, same faded flannel shirt, but his eyes were different. They glowed faintly, a dull gold that seemed to pulse in time with the music. "Caleb?" I whispered, rising from my chair. He didn't respond. He didn't move. The crowd didn't seem to notice him, their laughter and applause rising to a fever pitch. I stepped toward him, my heart hammering in my chest. As I approached, he tilted his head, his lips parting as though to speak. But what came out wasn't a voice. It was a sound, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones. The music stopped. The crowd fell silent, their heads snapping toward Caleb in unison. For the first time, their smiles faded, replaced by something colder, hungrier. "Time to go," the man in the threadbare suit said, his voice tight with urgency. But I couldn't move. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. The clock tower's frozen hands jerked forward, ticking wildly until they aligned at midnight once more. The lights above us flickered and died, plunging the square into darkness. And then the screaming began. I don't know how I got out. The next thing I remember is waking up in my car, parked at the edge of the forest. The invitation was gone, but my hands smelled faintly of earth. My nails caked with dirt I couldn't explain. I drove until the trees thinned, until the sky lightened, until Black Hollow was a distant blur in my rearview mirror. But the hum followed me. It's faint now, a low vibration at the edge of hearing. It grows louder at night, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see Caleb's glowing stare, his lips parting to speak words I can't bear to hear. The centennial celebration wasn't for the town. It was for me. The painting arrived without explanation. It wasn't a gift. There was no note, no sender's name, no receipt. Just a flat, rectangular package leaning against Eleanor's door when she came home from work, its brown paper faintly damp from the mist that hung in the evening air. She hesitated, the plastic bag of groceries biting into her hand. The hallway of her apartment building was quiet, the kind of sterile silence that reminded her how little she knew her neighbors. Her name was scrawled across the front of the package, the letters sharp and deliberate. She shouldn't have taken it inside. But curiosity has a way of eclipsing reason. Within minutes, the package was lying on her kitchen table, the groceries forgotten. She slid her finger under the tape, peeling it back with slow precision. The paper fell away, revealing an ornate, gilded frame. And the painting, it was unlike anything she'd seen before. At first glance, it looked simple enough. A forest scene, the kind you'd find in any half-forgotten gallery. A dense grove of dark trees, their branches tangled and clawing toward a gray sky. A narrow path wound through the center, vanishing into the shadows. But there was something about it that held her, something in the way the brushstrokes seemed to breathe. The trees almost looked like they swayed. The light filtering through the leaves seemed to shift, as if the sun were moving beyond the canvas. Eleanor tilted her head, frowning. The painting didn't match the muted tones of her apartment. It belonged somewhere older, a space with high ceilings and creaking floors. But as much as she wanted to pack it away, she couldn't. Her eyes kept returning to the path. By the time the sun set, the painting was hanging on her living room wall. That night, she dreamed of trees. They loomed above her, their bark dark as coal, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The path stretched ahead, twisting and narrowing, always just beyond her grasp. She could hear something, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps matching her own. She turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but the path was empty. When she woke, the painting was the first thing she saw. The trees in the frame had changed. She rubbed her eyes, sure she was imagining it, but the shift was unmistakable. The branches were closer now, bending inward, forming a canopy so thick the light barely pierced it. The path was darker, its edges frayed. She stepped closer, her breath catching as she noticed something else. Footprints. Tiny, pale imprints on the path, leading deeper into the forest. Someone's playing a trick, she muttered, though the words felt weak. By afternoon, the air in her apartment had changed. It felt heavier, thicker, like it carried an unspoken weight. The painting seemed brighter now, the trees more vivid, their bark glistening with a dampness that hadn't been there before. Eleanor stared at it for a long time, the hum of her thoughts growing louder until she couldn't stand it anymore. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she took a picture. But when she checked the screen, the photo showed nothing but an empty frame. Her stomach tightened. "I'm just tired," she said aloud, though the silence in the room made her voice sound small. That night, she dreamed again. This time, she was on the path. The trees crowded around her, their branches twisting and weaving into strange shapes. She tried to turn back, but the forest pressed in, guiding her forward. The air was damp and cold, and the rhythmic sound was louder now, almost like breathing. Ahead, something flickered. A light. A figure. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The painting seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, the path now fully swallowed by shadow. She could feel it pulling at her, an invisible thread tugging her toward the canvas. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She didn't bother with gloves or tools. She grabbed the frame with her bare hands and ripped it from the wall, her fingers trembling as she carried it to the hallway. It was heavier than it should have been, the weight pressing against her chest as she made her way to the dumpster behind the building. She hurled it inside, the frame cracking against the metal with a hollow sound. For a moment, she stood there, breathless, her palms damp with sweat. The painting lay crooked and lifeless, its branches still. That night, she slept soundly for the first time in days. When she woke, the painting was back on her wall. Eleanor screamed. This time, the path was gone entirely. The forest filled the frame, the trees pressing against the edges as though they were trying to escape. The footprints were closer, larger now, their shape no longer human. She didn't go to work that day. She didn't answer her phone, didn't leave her apartment. All she could do was sit on the couch, staring at the painting, waiting for something to happen. When the knock came, it was soft at first, then louder. She rose slowly, her legs stiff, and opened the door. No one was there, but just beyond the threshold, she saw it. A trail of footprints, damp and pale, leading down the hallway. She turned back to the painting. The frame was empty, and behind her, the sound of breathing. The house at the end of Laur Street had always been empty. When I was a kid, my friends and I made up stories about it, spun wild tales of ghosts or murderers or treasures buried in the walls. The kind of stories kids tell to make the world more interesting, more alive. But none of us ever dared to go inside. The house wasn't abandoned, not exactly. The lawn was always freshly mowed, the hedges trimmed, but no one ever saw who did it. The windows were dark year-round, the curtains drawn tight, and the mailbox remained stubbornly empty no matter how many flyers or letters we crammed into it on dares. It was the kind of place you stopped noticing once you grew up, the way you stopped noticing cracks in the sidewalk or the hum of fluorescent lights. That changed last month. It was late evening, and I was walking home from work. The neighborhood was quiet, the orange glow of streetlights stretching long shadows across the pavement. As I passed the house, something caught my eye. A faint flicker of light in one of the upstairs windows. I stopped, squinting up at it. It wasn't a lamp or a candle. It was too unsteady, almost like the light was moving, dancing along the glass. Then it went out. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe some leftover paranoia from childhood. But when I looked at the house again, I noticed something else. The curtains on the second floor were slightly open. I didn't remember them ever being open before. The next morning, the curtains were shut again, but the memory of the light stayed with me. A week later, I saw the woman. She was standing at the edge of the lawn, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, falling in a straight curtain over her shoulders. She was barefoot, wearing a pale dress that looked almost too thin for the season, as though she'd stepped out of another time. I slowed my pace, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. Something about the way she stood, perfectly still, made my stomach knot. I was about to say something, maybe a polite, "Are you okay?" When she turned, her face was wrong. Not in a grotesque or horrifying way, but subtly, unnervingly off. Her features didn't sit quite right, like a photograph slightly out of focus. Her eyes were too large, too dark, and they didn't blink. She smiled. I walked faster. That night, I dreamed of the house. In the dream, I was standing in the front yard, staring up at the second-floor window. The light was back, flickering faintly against the glass. The front door creaked open, and I felt a pull, an irresistible urge to step inside. When I woke, the sheets were damp with sweat, and my heart was racing. The house began appearing more frequently in my thoughts, intruding into quiet moments like a splinter under the skin. I started walking past it deliberately, slowing my pace to scan the windows, the lawn, the shadows beneath the porch. The woman was always there now. Sometimes she stood at the edge of the yard, sometimes by the front door, her face tilted toward the sky like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. Once, I saw her in the upstairs window, her silhouette backlit by that strange, flickering light. She always smiled when she saw me. The breaking point came 2 nights ago. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. a faint tapping at the window. It was so soft I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. But then it came again. Sharp, deliberate. I froze. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. Just the empty street below, lit by the pale glow of the street lamp. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were on the fire escape, faint but unmistakable. Bare footprints, traced in a fine layer of ash, leading from the bottom rung to the window. I didn't sleep the next night. Yesterday, I went to the house. I don't know what I thought I'd find, but the pull was too strong to ignore. The lawn was perfectly manicured, as always, and the house loomed above me, its windows dark and inscrutable. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of old wood and something faintly metallic. The floors creaked under my weight, and the shadows stretched too far, moving like liquid as I walked through the rooms. The house was empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just bare walls and dust-covered floors. But upstairs, the light was waiting. It poured out from beneath a door at the end of the hallway, flickering like firelight but colder, sharper. As I approached, the air grew colder, and I could hear a faint sound, like whispers just beyond the threshold. The door opened before I could touch it. The room was empty, except for the woman. She stood in the center, her back to me, her hair cascading down her back in a way that seemed too perfect, too deliberate. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice soft, almost kind. I couldn't answer. She turned slowly, and this time her face was clear. It was my face. Her smile widened, stretching too far, and the light around her flared, filling the room with a blinding whiteness. When I woke, I was back in my apartment, but the curtains were drawn, and the footprints on the fire escape were gone. The house is still there, waiting, and I think, somehow, I'm waiting too. The suitcase was navy blue, a model I'd never seen before, and its wheels creaked faintly as it rolled across the floor. It appeared on a Thursday morning, tucked in the corner of the bedroom like a guest waiting to be acknowledged. I wouldn't have noticed it right away if it weren't for the tag dangling from the handle. A thick paper card with a handwritten note. Room for 2, always. The handwriting wasn't his. When he walked in from the shower, towel draped over his shoulders, I nodded toward it. New suitcase? He glanced at it quickly, then shrugged. Work thing. They gave it to us at the conference last week. I raised an eyebrow. Since when do conferences hand out free luggage? Some kind of promotional gift, he said, rifling through his drawer. You know how these things are. I didn't. Actually, he worked in marketing, where the usual takeaways were branded pins or reusable water bottles, not luggage with cryptic love notes. The suitcase stayed there for 3 days, unopened. I thought about asking again, but the question felt too heavy. Instead, I spent my time watching for something to shift, some explanation that would make it fit into the life we'd built. One evening, he left for the gym. He kissed me on the cheek, his goodbye as casual as ever, and told me not to wait up. The moment his car pulled away, I walked into the bedroom and unzipped the suitcase. Inside, neatly arranged, were clothes I didn't recognize. A floral dress folded beside a pair of black heels. A scarf that smelled faintly of vanilla. Tucked into the lining was a smaller compartment, and inside that, I found a photo. In the picture, he was standing in front of a lake, his arm around a woman I'd never met. Her smile was wide, confident, and she wore the floral dress from the suitcase. The note on the back read, "Still feels like a dream." See, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo, the air around me thick with unasked questions. When he came home, I didn't mention it. Not yet. The next day, I took the afternoon off work and followed him. He'd told me he was meeting a client downtown, but instead, he drove to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. He parked outside a small white house with a blue door and carried a grocery bag to the porch. When the door opened, the woman from the photo greeted him. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that they ached. She kissed him on the cheek, then led him inside, the door clicking shut behind them. That evening, he walked in as though nothing had happened. He kissed me again, asked how my day was, and flipped through the mail with a practiced ease that made me sick. "The suitcase," I said, cutting through his small talk. He glanced up, startled. "What about it? Who's it for?" His smile faltered, the crack so brief it could have been missed by anyone who wasn't looking closely. "I told you. It's from the conference." I walked into the bedroom, grabbed the photo from where I'd hidden it in my nightstand, and placed it on the kitchen table. "Does she go to conferences too?" He stared at the photo for a long moment, his face draining of color. Then he sat down, his head in his hands. "It's not what it looks like," he said, his voice low. "Then what is it?" He took a deep breath but didn't lift his head. "Her name's Camille. We met a few months ago. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious." I waited, giving him a chance to fill the silence with whatever justification he thought would soften the blow. But he stayed quiet, his shoulders hunched, as though he'd been caught in a storm he hadn't prepared for. "Does she know about me?" I asked finally. He shook his head. "No. I told her I was single." The weight of his words settled over me, thick and suffocating. I could have screamed, cried, thrown the suitcase out the window. Instead, I stood up and began clearing the table. "I'll pack your things," I said, my voice steady. "You don't have to." "I do." That night, as I loaded his clothes into bags, I found another note tucked into the pocket of his jacket. "Someday, just us. Promise." By the time he left, the house felt both empty and lighter. The silence wasn't comforting, but it wasn't unbearable either. Months later, I saw the woman, Camille, sitting at a cafe downtown. She was alone, a book in her hands, her hair catching the light in a way that made her look almost angelic. For a moment, I thought about walking over, about telling her the truth. But as I watched her smile at something on the page, I realized she probably already knew. When I got home, I pulled out the floral dress I'd found in the suitcase. I'd kept it, tucked away in the back of the closet, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. Now, I folded it neatly, placed it in a donation box, and shut the lid. There's no point holding on to things that don't belong to you. The postcard arrived without a stamp. It was tucked between the stack of utility bills and takeout menus in my mailbox, its corners slightly bent. The front showed a photograph of a lighthouse perched on a jagged cliff. The sky above it was a violent swirl of gray and black, and the ocean below churned as if caught in a storm. There was no return address, no handwriting on the back, just a single sentence printed in crisp, black ink. "Come and see." I turned the postcard over, searching for more. Nothing. I didn't recognize the lighthouse or the coastline, and I certainly didn't know who might have sent it. I set it on the kitchen counter and tried to forget about it. But that night, I dreamed of the lighthouse. It rose from the edge of a cliff that seemed to stretch endlessly above a restless sea. The light at its top flickered erratically, sweeping across the darkness like it was searching for something or someone. In the dream, I wasn't standing on the cliff. I was in the water, the waves pulling at me, dragging me down. The light swept past, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something beneath the surface. A shadow, vast and shifting, curling around me. I woke up gasping, my throat raw with the memory of salt water. The postcard was on my nightstand. I didn't put it there. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse was calling to me. It wasn't just the dreams, though those came every night, always the same. It was little things. A faint smell of salt in the air. The distant sound of waves, even though I lived nowhere near the coast. And then there was the light. At first, I thought it was a passing car. A beam of light would sweep across my apartment, bright enough to catch my attention before vanishing. But when I looked outside, the street was empty. I tried ignoring it. That worked until the second postcard arrived. This one showed the lighthouse again, but closer this time. The photograph seemed wrong, like it had been taken just slightly out of focus. The edges of the lighthouse blurred into the sky, and the ocean below it looked darker than it should have been. The back of the postcard had another message, short and ominous. "You're almost there." Almost where? I turned it over and over in my hands, looking for some clue, some explanation. There was none. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the words following me like a shadow. That night, the dream changed. This time, I was on the cliff. The air was cold and damp, the kind that sticks to your skin and weighs you down. The lighthouse loomed above me, its walls streaked with rust and grime. The door was open. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The staircase wound upward, its steps slick and uneven. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, sharp and sour. The beam of light from the top swept past, illuminating the walls in brief, flickering bursts. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. It echoed through the tower, wrapping around me like a physical thing. I woke before I could see what was waiting at the top. The next morning, I booked a ticket to the nearest coastal town. It felt absurd, chasing after a postcard and a dream. But the feeling wouldn't let go. It gnawed at the edges of my mind, filling me with a restless urgency that I couldn't explain. When I arrived, the town was nearly deserted. The streets were lined with boarded-up shops, their signs faded and cracked. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and decay, and the only sound was the distant crash of waves against the rocks. The lighthouse was easy to find. It stood exactly as it had in the postcards, perched on a cliff that seemed impossibly high, its light flickering erratically. The sky above it was gray and churning, though there wasn't a storm in sight. I climbed the path leading to the top, the wind whipping around me, carrying faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. The door to the lighthouse was open. Inside, the staircase spiraled upward, just like in the dream. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air growing colder as I climbed. When I reached the top, the room was empty. The light swept past, blinding me for a moment before plunging me back into darkness. I stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath my weight, and saw something lying in the center of the room. It was another postcard. This one was blank. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and turned it over. The back read, "You're here." The light swept past again, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't my shadow. When I turned, it was gone. I don't remember leaving the lighthouse. I woke up back in my apartment, the postcard clutched tightly in my hand. The light hasn't stopped since. It sweeps through my home, across the windows, over my walls, even in the dead of night. And when I close my eyes, I see the shadow, waiting in the corner. I think it's waiting for me to come back. The watchmaker never accepted walk-ins. His shop sat at the edge of town, squeezed between an abandoned bookstore and a flower shop that never seemed to sell any flowers. The sign on the window read, "By appointment only," though no one ever saw anyone enter or leave. I'd lived in Hawthorne my whole life, and for as long as I could remember, the watchmaker had been there. The shop was a fixture, as much a part of the town as the old clock tower or the cobblestone streets. People spoke of him the way they spoke of things too distant to matter. An oddity, nothing more. Until the day my grandfather's pocket watch stopped working. It was his most prized possession, a battered silver piece with hands that ticked steadily no matter what. He'd carried it through wars and weddings, storms and funerals. When the watch finally gave out, he held it in his hands like something fragile. "It's not broken," he muttered, turning it over in his fingers. "It's stuck." The watch was still, its hands frozen at 3:11. He insisted I take it to the watchmaker. "No one else will fix it," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. I didn't argue. The shop smelled of oil and old wood, the air thick with the faint metallic tang of worn gears. Clocks lined every surface, their faces gleaming under the dim light. They ticked in unison, a precise rhythm that felt less like time and more like a heartbeat. The watchmaker appeared without sound, emerging from a shadowed doorway at the back of the shop. He was tall and thin, his face sharp and pale, his hands encased in thin leather gloves. "You brought something for me," he said, his voice soft but firm. I hesitated, holding out the watch. "It's stuck," I said. He took it carefully, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. A chill ran through me, but I didn't pull away. He examined the watch, tilting it under the light. "Ah," he said, almost to himself. "A refusal." "A refusal?" I echoed. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the back room, the door creaking shut behind him. I waited. The clocks around me continued their steady ticking, the sound growing louder, sharper, until it filled the room. Minutes passed. Then the door opened again, and the watchmaker stepped out, holding the watch in his gloved hand. "It is fixed," he said, handing it back to me. The hands were moving again, ticking steadily, but not at the correct time. The watch now read 12:47. "It's wrong," I said. "No," he replied. "It's exactly as it should be." Before I could protest, he gestured toward the door. "You should leave now." There was a weight to his words, a finality that made my stomach tighten. I left without asking questions, the watch clutched tightly in my hand. When I gave it back to my grandfather, he stared at it for a long time. 12:47, he murmured. "It's time, then." "Time for what?" I asked. He didn't answer. That night, he died. The coroner's report said heart failure, but I couldn't stop thinking about the watch, about the watchmaker. I went back the next day, ignoring the by appointment only sign. The shop was empty. The clocks were gone, the shelves bare. Even the faint scent of oil and metal had vanished. Only the watchmaker's voice remained in my mind, soft and certain. "It's exactly as it should be." The first time I heard about the quiet game, it was from a coworker. Melissa, a middle-aged woman who wore oversized glasses and never talked about her personal life, mentioned it casually during lunch. "Have you ever tried it?" she asked, her fork poised over a half-eaten salad. I shrugged. "What, like a meditation thing?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Not exactly. It's different. You play it at night, alone. The rules are simple. You sit in complete silence for as long as you can. No music, no distractions. You can't talk, hum, or even whisper. Just listen." I laughed it off, thinking it sounded like a gimmick, something people made up for internet clout. But Melissa didn't laugh. She just stared at me with those watery eyes, her hand gripping the fork so tightly her knuckles went white. "If you hear them," she said softly, "don't respond." The conversation stuck with me, though I didn't want it to. Something about her tone, the way her voice dipped like she was confessing a crime, made it hard to shake. That night, after scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I looked up the quiet game. There wasn't much, just a handful of vague forum posts and a few low-quality YouTube videos. Most people claimed it was nonsense, a way to scare yourself for fun. Others warned against it, saying things like, "It's not a game," or, "If you start, you have to finish." I wasn't scared, not really. If anything, I was curious. It sounded harmless, like Bloody Mary or Ouija boards. Urban legends designed to make you feel something. So, at midnight, I turned off my phone, dimmed the lights, and sat on the couch. At first, it was boring. The house creaked occasionally, the hum of the fridge filled the background, and I could hear the faint sound of traffic outside. But other than that, it was just me and the quiet. I lasted about 15 minutes before I got restless. I was about to reach for my phone when I thought about Melissa's expression, the sharpness of her voice when she'd said, "If you hear them, don't respond." I decided to give it another 5 minutes. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping. It was so soft I almost missed it, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against a tabletop. It came from the corner of the room, near the window. I froze, straining to hear. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe the house settling, or a tree branch brushing against the glass. But then it started again, louder this time. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still. My first instinct was to call out, ask if someone was there. But Melissa's words echoed in my head, "Don't respond." The tapping turned into scratching, a slow, deliberate sound that made my skin crawl. It moved closer, shifting from the window to the wall behind me. I gripped the edge of the couch, my breath shallow. I wanted to turn around, to see if there was something, or someone, there, but I couldn't. The scratching stopped, and then I heard the voice. It was faint at first, almost a whisper, but it came from right behind me. "Hello?" The voice was small, uncertain, like a child's. "Can you hear me?" it asked. I bit my lips so hard I tasted blood. The voice moved, circling the room, growing louder with each word. "Why won't you answer?" it said, the tone sharper now, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away. The room fell silent again, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, the voice spoke again, right next to my ear. "Don't be rude." I bolted. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't grab my phone. I just ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and crawled under the covers like a child hiding from a nightmare. The silence was deafening. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. No scratches on the walls, no sign of anyone trying to break in. I convinced myself it was a bad dream, my brain running wild with Melissa's creepy story. But then I noticed the words. They were scrawled on my living room wall, faint but unmistakable. "Why didn't you answer?" I scrubbed the wall clean, telling myself it had to be a prank. Maybe someone had gotten into the house, kids messing around, leaving graffiti behind. That night, I locked every door and window. I turned on the TV and left it playing while I fell asleep. The sound of sitcom laughter a flimsy shield against the memory of that voice. But the quiet doesn't need doors or windows to get in. At 3:12 a.m., I woke to the sound of tapping again. This time, it was louder, more aggressive, and it came from inside the bedroom. The voice followed soon after, angrier now, less patient. "You shouldn't have started." The words felt like needles piercing my ears. I stayed silent, clutching the blanket to my chest as if it could protect me. "You can't ignore us forever," it hissed, the sound reverberating through the room. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw something in the corner. A figure, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its face hidden in shadow. The light stabilized, and it was gone. By morning, the words had returned, carved into the headboard of my bed this time. "Play again. I've tried everything. Moving didn't help. Leaving the lights on doesn't help. Even staying with friends only works temporarily. The quiet always finds me. Every night, it's the same routine. The tapping, the scratching, the voice. Each time, it grows louder, angrier. It doesn't want to be ignored. I haven't spoken a word in days. I'm too afraid that if I do, it'll be enough to let them in completely. But the silence is unbearable, and they know it." I was 6 months into my new job when I realized I hated it. It wasn't the work itself. I could handle spreadsheets, presentations, and the endless parade of emails. It was the office. Something about it was wrong. It didn't have the charm of old architecture or the sterility of a modern skyscraper. It just felt off. The building was tall but narrow, wedged awkwardly between two larger, newer structures in the city's financial district. Its facade was all mismatched bricks and grimy windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. On my first day, the elevator was out of service, so I climbed 6 flights of creaky stairs to reach our floor. I arrived out of breath, greeted by fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly and a row of cubicles that looked like they'd been imported from the 1980s. My desk was in the corner, far from the windows. My coworker, Jenna, sat next to me, and we bonded quickly over our mutual disdain for the office's questionable charm. She called it the afterthought, a name that stuck with the team. Still, it wasn't a bad job, and I needed the money. So, I settled in, adjusted to the flickering lights, and tried not to notice the odd quirks of the building. But then people started disappearing. It was subtle at first. A guy from accounting, Greg, stopped showing up. No one made much of it. Maybe he quit, moved on, found something better. But then Angela from HR vanished too. A quiet, nervous woman who barely spoke to anyone, gone without a word. When I asked Jenna about it, she shrugged. "People leave all the time," she said, though her tone didn't sound convinced. "This place probably gets to them." Still, it gnawed at me. The company wasn't great, but it wasn't bad enough to have this kind of turnover. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something no one wanted to acknowledge. The building didn't help. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed too thin, where whispers carried farther than they should. I'd hear sounds sometimes, soft footsteps in the empty stairwell, the faint creak of a chair in a room no one used. Once, I stayed late to finish a report and thought I saw a shadow move across the office, even though I was alone. Then there was the elevator. It was ancient, the kind with a brass gate you had to slide open, and it groaned every time it moved. Half the time, it wasn't working, and when it was, I avoided it. There was something unsettling about the way the lights inside flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. Jenna joked it was haunted, but her laugh always sounded forced. One morning, I arrived to find a new memo pinned to the bulletin board near the break room. It was handwritten, not printed, and it read, "Do not use the stairs after 7 p.m. No signature, no explanation. Just those words in sharp, jagged handwriting." When I showed it to Jenna, she frowned. "Weird. Probably a prank." "From who?" I asked. "Greg? Angela? They're gone." She didn't respond. Instead, she crumpled the memo and tossed it in the trash. That night, I worked late again. Jenna had already left, and the office was eerily quiet. The hum of the lights seemed louder than usual, pressing against my ears. At 7:15, I packed my things and headed for the stairs, only to find the door locked. That was strange. The stairwell was never locked. I tried the handle again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. My heart rate picked up as I turned back toward the elevator, the only other way out. I hesitated before stepping inside. The elevator had always felt unreliable, but now, standing there in the silence, it felt like stepping into a trap. Still, I didn't have a choice. The button glowed dimly under my finger as I pressed for the lobby. The elevator lurched to life with a groan, descending slowly. Too slowly. I watched the numbers tick down. 6, 5, 4. Then it stopped. The light on the display froze at 3, and the elevator shuddered to a halt. I hit the emergency button, but no sound came. I pressed it again, harder this time, but it was useless. The air inside felt too warm, and I tried not to panic as I reached for my phone. No service. And then, the lights flickered. The dim glow cast strange, distorted shadows on the walls. I stared at my reflection in the brass gate, watching as the lights flickered again. The shadow behind me shouldn't have been there. I spun around, but the elevator was empty. The space behind me was nothing but brass and flickering light. But the shadow hadn't been mine. It had been taller, darker, something with too many angles to make sense. The lights flickered once more and went out entirely. I stood frozen in the pitch black, my breath shallow, waiting for the elevator to move again, for the lights to come back, for anything. When the lights returned, the brass gate was open, and the elevator door revealed a hallway I didn't recognize. It wasn't the lobby. It wasn't even part of our building. The walls were gray and bare, the floors concrete, and the air smelled of damp earth. A faint light glowed at the end of the corridor, and though every instinct screamed at me to stay inside the elevator, I stepped out. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, the light at the end growing no closer no matter how far I walked. My footsteps echoed too loud, as if the space were amplifying them. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. I stopped. The sound continued. It was soft at first, the shuffle of something moving closer. Then it grew louder, faster, like a sprint. I turned and ran, back toward the elevator, toward safety, but the hallway didn't end. It didn't matter how far I ran or how loudly I screamed. The footsteps followed, closer, closer, until they were right behind me, and I felt a hand brush my shoulder. And then, I was in the lobby. I don't remember getting there. One moment, I was running for my life, and the next, I was standing in the fluorescent light of the building's ground floor, gasping for breath. I quit the next day. I didn't tell Jenna. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to know if they believed me or not. I just walked out of that building and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it again. The faint shuffle of footsteps just behind me, and I wonder if I ever really left. The key arrived in an unmarked envelope, dropped through my mail slot on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. I almost threw it out, assuming it was a mistake. But when I opened the envelope, the key fell into my palm, smooth and cold. It was old brass, with faint scratches along its length, and oddly heavy for its size. There was no note, no explanation, just the key. I turned it over in my hand, examining the faint etching near the bow. A small, intricate symbol I didn't recognize. I didn't know what it was for, and yet, holding it filled me with a strange, nagging unease. I put it in the drawer by the door and tried not to think about it. That night, I dreamt of a door. It stood alone in a dark expanse, unattached to walls or a frame, just a solitary, weathered door floating in an infinite void. The brass key was in my hand, and though I didn't want to, I felt myself walking toward it. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the emptiness, growing louder with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The key slid into the lock easily, the metal cool against my fingertips. I turned it. The door creaked open, and something moved on the other side. Something vast, shifting in the darkness. I woke with a start, my chest heaving, my bedsheets damp with sweat. The drawer where I'd placed the key was open. I told myself it was nothing. I must have left it open before going to bed, or maybe I'd imagined closing it in the first place. But when I checked the drawer, the key was gone. I found it later, sitting on the kitchen counter. I hadn't put it there. Over the next few days, the key kept appearing in places it shouldn't. My bathroom sink, my coat pocket, once, on the pillow next to me when I woke. Each time I saw it, a cold weight settled in my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It didn't belong to me, but it wouldn't let me go. The dreams returned every night. Always the same door, standing alone in the void, the key pulling me closer. Each time I opened it, the shifting presence on the other side grew clearer, an undulating mass of shadow and light, its edges impossible to define. It didn't have eyes, but I felt it watching me. On the 7th day, I stopped dreaming. That should have been a relief, but the silence that replaced the dreams was worse. The air in my apartment felt heavier, the shadows longer. And then the knocking began. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the window, but I lived on the 3rd floor, with no trees nearby. The sound came in steady, rhythmic patterns, 3 knocks, then silence. I didn't open the door. The next morning, I found the key on my doorstep. The knocking grew louder each night, echoing through the apartment until it seemed to come from every wall at once. I tried leaving, staying at a friend's house, but the key followed me, appearing on the nightstand, in the glove compartment of my car, even tucked into my shoe. No matter where I went, it found me. By the 10th night, the knocking was relentless. My walls trembled with the force of it, and my lights flickered like candles in a storm. I sat on the floor with the key in my hand, its weight heavier than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. When the knocking came again, I stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and walked to the door. I didn't know what I expected to find, but when I opened it, the hallway outside was empty, except for the door. It wasn't my apartment door anymore. It was the door, the one from my dreams. Weathered and worn, its surface scarred with age. The same strange symbol etched into its wood, faint but unmistakable. The key in my hand grew warmer, pulsing faintly, as if it were alive. I didn't want to go through it. Every part of me screamed to shut the door, to run, but my feet moved forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click, and the door swung open. The void was there, just as I dreamed it, and in the void, the presence waited. It loomed before me, its form shifting and expanding, filling the emptiness like ink spilling into water. It didn't speak, but I heard its voice all the same, deep and resonant, echoing inside my skull. You opened the door. You are the key. The air around me thickened, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to step back, but my body wouldn't respond. The presence reached for me, not with hands, but with tendrils of shadow, curling around me, pulling me closer. My vision blurred, the world dissolving into darkness. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The door was gone. Everything seemed normal at first. The lights worked. The walls were silent. Even the air felt lighter. For the first time in days, I thought it might be over. But then I noticed the key. It wasn't in the drawer or on the counter. It was in my hand. And this time, the symbol wasn't etched into the metal. It was etched into my skin. I can feel it now, pulsing faintly beneath my palm. The knocking hasn't returned, but at night, I hear whispers in the walls, soft and distant, calling me back to the door. I know it's only a matter of time. I first noticed the lamp on my walk home from work, sitting alone on the curb like someone had left it there by accident. It wasn't particularly special, a tall, brass floor lamp with an old-fashioned shade, the kind you might find in a grandparent's living room. The fabric of the shade was frayed in places, but the base gleamed faintly under the street lights. I don't know why I stopped to look at it. Maybe it was the way it seemed out of place, as though it belonged somewhere much older and grander than this rundown part of the city. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It was surprisingly light, and when I held it, there was something oddly warm about the metal, as if it had been basking in sunlight even though the day had been overcast. I brought it home and set it in the corner of my living room. It fit perfectly, the brass catching the glow from my ceiling light just right. There was no cord to plug in, which I found odd, but I figured it was broken. I'd fix it later, or maybe just use it as decoration. That night, I woke to find the lamp glowing. The shade cast a soft, golden light across the room, illuminating the edges of my furniture and pooling in the corners. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The lamp had no bulb, no cord, no power source. Yet there it was, steady and bright, humming faintly in the silence. I stood at the edge of the room, hesitant to approach. The air felt charged, the kind of tension you feel before a storm. I reached out and touched the brass base. The hum grew louder. It wasn't a sound, exactly, but a sensation, vibrating through my hand and into my chest. I pulled away quickly, my heart racing, and the light dimmed, flickering once before going out completely. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the street lamps outside. But when I got home, the lamp was glowing again. This time, it was different. The light was brighter, casting sharper shadows across the walls. The hum was constant now, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within the brass. As I stood there, staring, the light shifted. It wasn't just a glow anymore. It was moving. The patterns on the walls began to swirl, the shadows elongating and twisting as though they had a life of their own. I watched, frozen, as the light coalesced into shapes. At first, they were abstract, shimmering, fluid forms that reminded me of ripples on water. But then they became clearer. Faces. They appeared one by one, their features indistinct but undeniably human. Eyes, mouths, faint outlines of expressions frozen in mid-scream. The faces pressed against the walls, their shadows stretching toward me as though trying to pull themselves free. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. The lamp's hum grew louder, the light pulsating in time with it. One of the faces turned toward me, its eyes locking onto mine. I couldn't move. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light vanished. The room was silent, the lamp standing innocently in the corner as though nothing had happened. I wanted to get rid of it. I should have taken it back to the curb or smashed it into pieces, but something stopped me. There was a pull, an unshakable sense that the lamp wasn't just an object. It was a door, or a key, or something that wanted to be understood. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, watching the lamp, waiting. It didn't glow this time. It just stood there, silent and unassuming, as though daring me to touch it again. By the time dawn broke, I had made my decision. I reached out and turned the small, decorative switch near the base. The light flared to life, brighter than before. The faces returned, but they weren't confined to the walls anymore. They floated in the air, their forms shifting and merging, their eyes fixed on me. A voice emerged from the hum, low and layered, as though 100 people were speaking at once. "You brought us here." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I don't understand." The faces twisted, their features contorting into something darker. "You turned it on. You opened the way." The room grew colder, the light pulsing faster, casting the faces into sharp relief. I backed away, but the shadows followed, curling around my legs like smoke. "What do you want?" I whispered. The lamp's light flickered, and the voice responded, "To return." Before I could ask what that meant, the light exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding flash. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in a place I didn't recognize. The walls were made of brass, smooth and seamless, curving upward into an impossible height. The air was thick with the same hum, vibrating through my bones. Shadows flickered across the walls, their movements quick and erratic, like they were alive. In the center of the room stood the lamp, its light steady and unrelenting. The shadows began to converge, forming into a single mass that loomed over me. Faces emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly as they spoke in unison. "You have taken our place." Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward, consuming me. When I woke, I was back in my living room. The lamp was gone, and so was the light. But the hum remains, faint and constant, just at the edge of hearing. And sometimes, when the room is dark, I catch glimpses of faces in the corners, watching, waiting. I found the box in the attic of my grandmother's house the week after her funeral. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, wrapped in thick twine and sealed with a rusted padlock. The wood was dark and rough, scratched as though it had been buried and dug up again. On the lid, in faint, uneven letters, were the words, "Do not open." At first, I left it where it was, tucked in the corner of the attic, beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. I wasn't looking for it, after all. I'd come to sort through her things, decide what to keep, what to sell, and what to donate. The house was cluttered with a lifetime of objects, each one a reminder of the woman who had lived here alone for so many years. The box should have stayed in the attic. I should have ignored it, left it to gather dust like everything else, but something about it pulled at me. The warning on the lid felt personal, as though it were meant for me and me alone. By the third day, I gave in. The lock was old, the metal brittle. It broke easily under the weight of a hammer. The twine fell away in pieces, and the lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing the contents inside. At first, I thought the box was empty. The bottom was lined with black velvet, smooth and untouched. But as I tilted it in the light, I saw something glinting in the corner. It was a photograph. The image was faded and grainy, the kind you'd expect to find in an old shoebox of family keepsakes. It showed a house, small and nondescript, surrounded by a dense forest. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar. In the foreground stood a woman. She wasn't my grandmother. I couldn't place her face at first. She looked ordinary, plain clothes, hair pulled back in a loose bun. But there was something about her posture, the way she stood, that made me uneasy. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her head was turned slightly, as though she'd heard a sound behind her. On the back of the photograph, in the same uneven handwriting as the lid, was a single word, "Watch." I didn't sleep that night. The image of the woman haunted me, her face lingering in the corners of my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, an old photograph that had no connection to me or my grandmother. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the box wasn't meant to be opened. The next morning, I found another photograph. It was on the kitchen table, propped up against the salt shaker as though someone had placed it there deliberately. My stomach turned as I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The same house, the same forest, but this time, the woman was closer. She stood at the edge of the trees, her face still turned away, her posture tense. The air around her seemed darker, the shadows heavier, as though the forest itself was leaning toward her. I flipped the photograph over. Listen, I threw it away, or I thought I did. The next day, it was back, sitting on my nightstand when I woke up. I stared at it for a long time, the unease in my chest growing sharper with each passing second. The house in the photo seemed familiar now, though I couldn't place why. I didn't recognize the forest, but there was something about the shape of the house, the angle of the roof, that tugged at the edges of my memory. The woman, too, had changed. She was closer again, standing in the middle of the yard. Her head was tilted back now, her face turned toward the sky. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and for the first time, I noticed something in her hand. A key. I didn't flip the photo over this time. I already knew there would be a message. That night, the dreams began. I was in the forest, the air thick with mist and the scent of damp earth. The trees loomed above me, their branches twisting into shapes that looked almost like letters. In the distance, I saw the house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The front door was wide open. I woke gasping for air. My sheets tangled around me. The photograph was on the pillow beside me, its edges curling slightly, as though it had been exposed to heat. The woman was inside the house now. I couldn't stop looking at it. Her figure was faint, barely visible through the dirty glass of the window. She was standing in the living room, her back to me, the key still clutched in her hand. On the back of the photo was a single word: come. I don't know why I went. The house was exactly as it looked in the photographs, small, weathered, and unnervingly silent. The forest around it was dense, the trees pressing in from every direction. The door was open, just as it had been in my dream. Inside, the air was heavy, the silence thick and oppressive. The walls were bare, the furniture covered in sheets that sagged under the weight of dust. And then I saw her. She stood in the corner of the room, her back to me, the key still hanging from her hand. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" Her head tilted slightly, her face still hidden. The key fell from her hand, hitting the floor with a sound that echoed far too loud in the empty house. I didn't pick it up. When she turned, her face was mine. The house is quiet now, but I can still hear the forest outside, the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of something I can't name. The photographs keep appearing. The woman is closer each time. I had never thought much about the bus. It was just a part of my daily commute, a beige and brown relic that rattled its way through the streets like an old man complaining under his breath. It came at 7:23 a.m. every weekday, and I'd board with the same small handful of people: a woman in a red scarf, a tired man in a suit, and a teenager who always had earbuds in and a bored expression on his face. We never spoke, but there was a quiet comfort in seeing them every day. Then one Thursday, the bus didn't stop. It passed by the stop without slowing, the driver staring straight ahead as if we didn't exist. I stood there, confused, as the others began pulling out their phones or grumbling about how they'd have to walk. That wasn't the strange part, though. The strange part was the bus itself. It wasn't the same bus. It had the same number, sure, Route 6, but the logo on the side was unfamiliar, written in a font I'd never seen. The windows were too small, and the shape of the vehicle was all wrong. Sleeker, like a bullet. I stared after it until it rounded the corner and disappeared. The next day, the bus came back, as if nothing had happened. Same driver, same tired groan of the engine. I got on, trying to shrug off the unease from the day before. "Missed you yesterday," I said to the driver, half joking. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. I took my usual seat near the middle, my bag in my lap, and glanced at the other passengers. That's when I noticed something was off. The teenager wasn't wearing his earbuds. His hands were clasped tightly on his knees, and he was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The woman in the red scarf had her scarf folded neatly in her lap, her fingers twitching against the fabric as if she were practicing piano scales. The man in the suit was reading a newspaper, but his eyes weren't moving. No one spoke. No one moved. The bus jerked to a stop, and I glanced out the window. It wasn't my stop. In fact, it wasn't anywhere I recognized. We were in the middle of a forest. Tall, shadowy trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches bare and twisting like the fingers of a skeletal hand. The pavement beneath us looked cracked and uneven, overgrown with weeds that crept toward the bus as though drawn to it. The driver didn't open the doors. No one got on. No one got off. The bus started moving again, its engine whining as it struggled against the incline of the road. I clutched my bag tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. "This isn't the route," I muttered, mostly to myself. No one answered. The road stretched on, curving deeper into the forest. The sky outside had turned a sickly shade of gray, the kind of color that makes you think a storm is about to break. But there was no rain, only silence, broken by the occasional groan of the bus's suspension. I decided to try speaking again. "Where are we going?" I asked, louder this time. The woman in the red scarf turned to look at me. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if she hadn't heard me properly, or as if she wasn't used to being addressed. "Same place as always," she said. Her voice was distant, hollow, as if she were reciting a line she didn't understand. I looked back at the driver. His hands were gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "This isn't right," I said louder still. "What's going on?" The teenager spoke without turning his head. "You shouldn't have gotten on." That was enough for me. I stood, stumbling slightly as the bus hit a bump, and made my way toward the front. "Stop the bus," I said. "Let me off." The driver didn't react. "Hey!" I shouted, slamming my hand against the plexiglass divider. "Stop the damn bus." The driver's head turned. Slowly. Too slowly. When he looked at me, I wished I hadn't spoken. His face was wrong. The features were there. Eyes, nose, mouth. But they didn't fit together properly, like a jigsaw puzzle forced into place. His eyes were too far apart, his mouth too wide, and his skin had a waxy, unnatural sheen. "We're almost there," he said, his voice distorted and layered, like multiple people speaking at once. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The windows were wrong now, too. The trees outside had stopped moving, frozen mid-sway as if the world itself had paused. But the bus kept moving, the wheels grinding against the road with a sound like breaking glass. I turned to the other passengers. "Doesn't anyone see this?" I shouted. The man in the suit folded his newspaper, his movements robotic. "It's not for you to understand," he said. The woman in the red scarf added, "It's your stop soon." "I don't have a stop," I yelled. The teenager finally turned to face me. His face was blank, not empty of expression, blank, as though someone had erased the features with a heavy hand. "This isn't for you," he said, his voice an echo of the driver's. I reached for the emergency cord, yanking it hard, but the bus didn't stop. The air grew colder, and the hum of the engine shifted into a low, pulsing vibration that I felt deep in my chest. The forest outside began to change. The trees melted into spindly shapes, their branches reaching upward like antennae. The road became a pale, uneven surface, its cracks glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. And then the bus stopped. The doors hissed open, revealing nothing but darkness outside. The passengers stood, one by one, moving in unison as they shuffled toward the exit. None of them looked at me. I stayed in my seat, clutching my bag as if it could protect me. The driver turned to face me again, his twisted smile stretching impossibly wide. "This is your stop," he said. "I'm not getting off," I whispered. But the passengers were already surrounding me, their movements slow and deliberate. The teenager reached out, his featureless face inches from mine. "You already did," he said, and then they pulled me into the darkness. The voicemail came in at 3:42 a.m., though my phone didn't ring. I saw it when I woke up that morning, the little icon blinking at me from the screen. The number wasn't one I recognized, just a string of zeros, too short to be real. Curious but cautious, I hit play. The message was short, barely 10 seconds long, but I replayed it 3 times before it made any sense. "Don't leave your door unlocked," the voice said. It was raspy, strained, as though the speaker had been whispering for hours. There was no introduction, no goodbye, just those 5 words. I checked the door immediately, heart racing. It was locked. I double-checked the deadbolt and the chain for good measure before telling myself it was probably a prank. It didn't feel like a prank, though. All day, the voicemail gnawed at me. I thought about blocking the number, but it wasn't even a real one. My phone's call history didn't show the voicemail coming in at all. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard a sound. It was faint, just on the edge of perception, like a creak or a soft knock. I froze, my toothbrush halfway to my mouth, straining to hear. Nothing. I finished brushing, checked the door again, and went to bed. The second voicemail arrived at 3:42 a.m. This time, my phone vibrated. Just once. I woke to see the same blinking icon and the same impossible number. "Don't leave your window open," the voice said. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The windows were closed. I was sure of it, but I had to check. My feet hit the floor before I even realized I was moving. The window in my bedroom was shut. So was the one in the living room. But when I got to the kitchen, my stomach dropped. The window was open, only a crack, just wide enough to let in a sliver of cool night air, but I knew I hadn't opened it. I slammed it shut and locked it, my hands trembling. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. I was tired, distracted. Maybe I'd left the window open earlier and forgotten. The voice had unnerved me, that's all. But when the third voicemail came, my excuses fell apart. It arrived at the exact same time, 3:42 a.m. "Don't go in the bathroom," the voice whispered. The air in my room felt colder than it should have, heavy with the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain to fill the void. I stared at the bathroom door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door was ajar, just enough for darkness to spill into the hallway. I should have stayed in bed. I should have ignored the message, turned over, and pulled the blankets over my head. Instead, I stepped closer. The bathroom was empty. No flickering lights, no shadows in the mirror. Just the faint smell of damp tile and the quiet hum of the night. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something in the mirror. Not a figure, not a shadow, just words. They were scrawled across the glass in faint, foggy letters, as though written by a finger in steam. "Stop listening." I didn't listen. That day, I called the phone company. They told me the number wasn't real, that there was no record of the calls. I even showed them my phone, but the voicemails didn't appear in my saved messages. It was like they'd never existed, but I knew they had. The fourth message came at 3:42 a.m. "Don't look outside." The voice was quieter now, almost pleading. I was sitting up in bed when it came, clutching my phone like it might answer my questions. My curtains were drawn, but I could feel something beyond them, waiting. The air outside the window felt heavy, pressing against the glass like a living thing. I didn't want to look, but I did. The street below was empty, lit only by the dim glow of the streetlights. And then, just beyond the edge of the light, something moved. It was too far away to make out clearly, just a shifting shape against the darkness. It didn't walk or run. It slid, like a shadow that didn't need legs. I yanked the curtains shut and backed away, my heart racing. The fifth voicemail didn't come the next night. I waited, staring at my phone, until the clock ticked past 3:42 a.m. Nothing. For the first time in days, I let out a shaky breath and let myself believe it might be over. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite, coming from the front door. I sat frozen, staring at the door as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I didn't move. The knocking stopped, and then my phone buzzed. This time, the message was different. The voice wasn't raspy or strained. It wasn't a whisper. It was calm, even. "I'm inside." The line went dead, and the floorboards behind me creaked. The man in the red jacket never spoke. He showed up on the corner of 8th and Main sometime in early October, standing perfectly still beneath the flickering streetlight. The first time I saw him, I thought he was just another eccentric local. An older man in a faded red coat, hands tucked into his pockets, face obscured by the brim of a black cap. He didn't do anything but stand there, staring at the traffic or the passing pedestrians. I might have ignored him entirely if not for the way people reacted. Most folks gave him a wide berth, crossing the street or taking long, arcing detours to avoid getting too close. Some glanced at him with the same mix of nervous curiosity I felt, but others, those who got too close, stopped dead in their tracks. They'd stand there for a moment, frozen, staring at him like they couldn't move. Then, just as quickly, they'd walk away, heads down, eyes wide. By the time I noticed him, he'd already become a fixture on the corner. Nobody seemed to know who he was or where he'd come from, but everyone had their theories. A homeless man, a ghost, a performer doing some kind of weird social experiment. I didn't think much of it until I passed him myself one night. It was late, well past midnight, and I was walking home from the bar. The streets were mostly empty, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. As I turned onto Main, I saw him standing there, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlight. The man in the red jacket didn't look at me. He didn't move. But as I approached, I felt an overwhelming urge to cross the street. Something about the way he stood, so perfectly still, sent a prickle of unease up my spine. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I was being ridiculous. As I got closer, though, the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, colder, like stepping into a freezer. The hum of the streetlight grew louder, its flickering more erratic. And then I saw him turn his head. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it felt deliberate. The brim of his hat tilted just enough for me to see the lower half of his face. He was smiling. Not a kind smile, not even a cruel one. It was the kind of smile you might see in a dream. Something stretched too wide, too sharp, like it didn't belong on a human face. I stopped. I didn't want to, but my body refused to move. My legs felt like lead. My breath caught in my throat. The streetlight above buzzed louder, drowning out every other sound. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. The longer I stood there, the more I became aware of something else, something behind him. At first, I thought it was a shadow, cast by the flickering light. But it wasn't a shadow. It was darker than the night around it, darker than anything I'd ever seen. It moved. The shadow writhed, twisting in ways that made my head hurt to look at. It seemed to pulse in time with the streetlight's flicker, growing larger with every beat. And then the man in the red jacket spoke. Or at least, I think he did. His lips didn't move, but his voice was in my head, clear and calm. "Don't look away." I didn't. I couldn't. The shadow grew closer, spilling across the pavement like ink. It reached my feet, cold and slick, and I felt something brush against my leg, something solid and alive. The man in the red jacket tilted his head, his smile growing wider. "Not yet," he said. "I don't remember how I got home. One moment, I was standing on the corner, trapped between him and the shadow. The next, I was waking up in my bed, drenched in sweat. For days, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare. But when I walked past the corner again, he was still there. The man in the red jacket didn't look at me, but I felt his eyes on me all the same. The shadow was gone, but the memory of it lingered, like the echo of a scream. People started disappearing not long after. It was subtle at first. Someone's coworker stopped showing up to work, or a neighbor's apartment stayed dark for days. Then it escalated. Entire blocks emptied out overnight. No one talked about it. No one questioned it. I tried to leave the city, but every road out was blocked. Construction, accidents, detours. It didn't matter how many routes I tried. I always ended up back where I started. The man in the red jacket is still there, standing beneath the flickering streetlight. I don't walk past him anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I see the shadow moving outside my window. The basement door was never locked before. My grandparents' house was old, creaky, and full of strange quirks. A place where every stair had its own distinct groan and every piece of furniture seemed to sit slightly off-kilter. But the basement door had always been one of the constants, swinging open with a faint scrape whenever the wind nudged it too hard. That's why I paused when I noticed the deadbolt. It was brand new, its silver surface gleaming against the weathered wood of the doorframe. My grandfather wasn't the type to install something like that. He was practical to a fault, the kind of man who thought anything beyond a latch was paranoid nonsense. I had come to the house to sort through their belongings after they both passed within weeks of each other. Most of the house was just as I remembered it. Faded wallpaper, the faint smell of lavender sachets in the drawers, and old picture frames lining the walls. Everything except the locked basement door. Curiosity got the better of me. I found the key in a drawer full of odds and ends, nestled between a box of rubber bands and a tin of sewing needles. It was small and brass, with no label or tag to suggest what it might unlock. The key fit perfectly. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air damp and thick with the smell of earth. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered faintly as I descended the narrow wooden stairs. At the bottom, the familiar concrete floor stretched out, cluttered with old tools, dusty jars, and forgotten furniture. But something was different. In the far corner of the basement stood a cabinet I didn't recognize. It was tall and dark, its surface carved with intricate patterns, swirls and lines that seemed to shift subtly when I looked at them too long. I hesitated. The cabinet didn't belong here. I had spent entire summers in this basement as a child, helping my grandfather sort bolts or chasing dust motes in the light from the tiny window. I knew every object in this space, every shadow. This was new. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. The cabinet door was ajar, revealing just a sliver of darkness within. Just an old piece of furniture. I muttered to myself, reaching out to pull the door open. The hinges didn't creak. They didn't make any sound at all, as if the air inside the cabinet absorbed noise completely. Inside was a mirror. It wasn't large, just big enough to show my upper body as I leaned in. The frame was made of the same dark wood as the cabinet, its surface smooth and cold. But the reflection didn't look right. At first, I thought it was just the dim light playing tricks on me. My face was there, but the edges were blurry, like a photo taken with a trembling hand. The shadows in the basement didn't align with the ones in the mirror. Then I realized something else. I wasn't moving. My reflection stood perfectly still, its eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I tilted my head to the side, but the figure in the mirror didn't follow. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The reflection stayed in place for a moment, then moved on its own. Slowly, it raised one hand, the fingers curling into a wave. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on sorting through my grandparents' things, but the memory of the reflection haunted me. I convinced myself it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even grief manifesting in strange ways. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, the familiar creaks and groans I'd grown up with. But these were deliberate, steady, coming from the floor below. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps climbed the stairs, pausing just outside my bedroom door. I didn't move. The handle turned slowly, the door creaking open an inch. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for someone, to step inside. But nothing did. The door stayed ajar, the hallway beyond pitch black. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I got up and turned on the light. The hallway was empty, but at the end of the hall, the basement door was open. I knew I had locked it. The air in the house felt heavier now, pressing against my chest with each step I took toward the stairs. The light in the hallway flickered as I passed beneath it. When I reached the basement, I hesitated. The door was wide open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I descended slowly, clutching the railing like it might vanish beneath my grip. The cabinet was still there, its door shut tight, the patterns on its surface seeming to writhe in the faint light from the overhead bulb. I wanted to leave, to lock the basement and never look back. But something drew me toward the cabinet again, the same irrational pull that had made me open it the first time. This time, the door opened on its own. The mirror was still inside, but the reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was my grandfather. He stood there, his expression blank, his eyes darker than I remembered. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed past me, into the shadows of the basement. I turned, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my grandmother was standing beside him. Her face was pale, her mouth moving silently, as though trying to speak words I couldn't hear. The bulb above flickered and went out. In the darkness, the air grew colder, and I felt the faintest brush of fingers against my shoulder. The last thing I heard was my grandmother's voice, faint and distant, whispering from the shadows, "Don't let it out." When the light returned, the cabinet was gone, but the basement door won't stay shut anymore. I'd always hated the silence of the library at night. During the day, it hummed with life. The shuffle of feet, whispered conversations, the soft rustle of pages turning. But after hours, when the last patron had left and the lights dimmed to a faint glow, the building seemed to exhale, settling into a deep, unnatural stillness. I'd been working there for 6 months, and I still hadn't gotten used to it. It was a Friday evening, and I was the last one in the building. Closing shifts were supposed to be simple. Straighten the shelves, lock the doors, turn off the lights. But tonight, something felt different. It had started with the desk lamp at the front counter. It flickered once, then again, before dying completely. The bulb was new, replaced just last week. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for the faint buzz of electricity to return, but the lamp stayed dark. Annoyed, I grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet and finished my rounds, the beam cutting through the shadows that stretched across the aisles. The flashlight was a cheap one, the kind that sputtered if you shook it too hard, but it worked well enough. I was about to head to the staff room to grab my bag when I noticed a book lying on one of the reading tables. It wasn't unusual to find stray books left behind. People forgot things all the time, but this one caught my eye. It was old, the kind of old that made you wonder how it had survived the years. Its leather cover was cracked, the edges frayed, and the title had been worn away, leaving only faint impressions of letters. I picked it up, surprised by its weight. The pages were yellowed and uneven, the ink faded but still legible. It wasn't a book I recognized, and I prided myself on knowing the library's collection inside and out. As I flipped through it, a strange unease settled over me. The pages were filled with dense, handwritten text, an unusual find in a library full of printed volumes. The handwriting was meticulous, almost too perfect, each letter a mirror of the last. And then, halfway through, I saw it. My name, written in bold, black ink. It sat there on the page like a mark burned into the paper. It wasn't part of the text. It was scrawled in the margin, as if someone had added it after the fact. Beneath my name was a date. Today's date. I felt a chill spread through my chest, my pulse quickening. My first thought was that it was a prank, some leftover relic of a bored patron's mischief. But as I flipped back to the front of the book, I realized something even stranger. There was no library barcode, no stamp, nothing to indicate that the book belonged to us. I set the book down, my hands trembling. I wanted to leave it there, to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. But as I backed toward the door, I heard it, the faintest sound, like a page being turned. I whipped around, the flashlight's beam darting across the room. The library was empty, the tables and chairs untouched. But the sound came again, this time louder, as though it were coming from somewhere deeper within the stacks. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I followed the noise. My footsteps echoed against the tile floor as I moved between the aisles, the air growing colder with each step. The sound grew clearer, a soft rustling, steady and deliberate, like someone flipping through a book. I turned a corner and froze. There, at the far end of the aisle, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me, the outline of its body just visible in the dim light. Its hands moved quickly, turning page after page in a book, so large it seemed to swallow the desk beneath it. "Hello?" My voice cracked, the word barely louder than a whisper. The figure stopped. Slowly, it turned its head, and my stomach dropped. Its face was blurred, like an out-of-focus photograph. No eyes, no mouth, just smudges where features should have been. But somehow, I knew it was looking at me. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure rose to its feet, the book left open on the desk, and began to move toward me. Its steps were slow, deliberate, the sound of its shoes against the floor unnervingly soft. I ran. The library felt endless, the aisles stretching on forever as I sprinted toward the front desk. The flashlight flickered, plunging me into brief moments of darkness, and in those moments, I swore I could hear breathing. When I finally reached the front counter, I slammed the flashlight down and grabbed my bag, fumbling with the strap as I searched for my keys. My hands shook so badly that I dropped them, the metallic clink echoing in the silence. And then, the breathing stopped. I looked up, and there it was. The figure stood just beyond the counter, its blurred face tilting slightly as if curious. In its hands was the book, the pages fluttering faintly though there was no wind. It raised a hand, a single finger pointing to the open page. My name was there again, written over and over, the ink darker now, almost wet. Beneath it, a single line of text had appeared. "You read. Now you stay." The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. When I woke up, the library was silent. The clock on the wall showed that hours had passed, though I had no memory of what happened after the lights went out. The book was gone. I quit the next day. But sometimes, when I walk past the library late at night, I hear it again. The sound of pages turning, soft, and deliberate. And I know it's still waiting for me. The clock on the wall of my apartment stopped ticking 3 nights ago. I noticed it while eating dinner, fork halfway to my mouth, the absence of the usual rhythmic sound pulling me out of whatever fog I'd been in. The hands were frozen at 8:42. I replaced the batteries, tapped the glass, and even shook the damn thing. But nothing worked. I should have just thrown it out, but I didn't. Something about its stillness unnerved me in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I woke up at exactly 8:42 p.m. It wasn't the clock. It hadn't moved since I first noticed it. What woke me was the sound of faint tapping, somewhere distant but distinct, like fingernails on glass. I lay there for a moment, holding my breath, until the sound stopped. The next day, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old pipes, maybe, or a draft. But when I came home from work, I found something that made my chest tighten. The clock had changed. The hands now pointed to 3:15. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even looked at it since the night before. It wasn't running, not even ticking. It shouldn't have moved. I took it off the wall, examining the back, the gears, the face. Everything was as it should be, except for the hands. I set it down on the counter, determined to ignore it. At 3:15 a.m., the tapping came back. This time, it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from my window. I live on the 4th floor. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe, listening as the sound grew more insistent. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the window was empty. Nothing but the faint glow of the streetlight outside and the silhouette of a tree swaying in the breeze. The next day, the clock read 11:11. It wasn't just the time that bothered me. It was the way the hands were positioned, slightly off-center, as if they'd been forced into place. I decided to get rid of it. I shoved the clock into a box and took it to the dumpster behind my building. The relief I felt when I slammed the lid shut was instant, like I'd finally shaken off something heavy. But when I came back upstairs, the clock was on my kitchen counter. I didn't understand. I had just thrown it away. There was no way it could be here. The hands were moving now, ticking forward in slow, deliberate motions. I watched, horrified, as the second hand crawled toward 12, then stopped. The time read 6:06. The tapping started again. This time, it came from inside the apartment. I turned toward the hallway, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound wasn't frantic. It was methodical, patient, moving closer. "Who's there?" I called out, though my voice came out small and cracked. No answer. The tapping stopped just outside the bedroom door. I stood frozen, every muscle locked, waiting for something to happen. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. There was no one there. But the hallway beyond was darker than it should have been, the shadows impossibly deep, like the light from the living room couldn't reach. The clock chimed behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The hands now pointed to 12 o'clock. The tapping resumed, louder this time, echoing through the apartment. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from the clock. I backed away, my stomach twisting, as the tapping grew more frantic. The glass face of the clock began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like a spider's web. Then it stopped. The apartment fell silent. I waited, breathless, staring at the clock, half expecting it to explode. But nothing happened. I thought it was over, until I saw the cracks shift. Something inside the clock was moving. A shadow, faint and fluid, writhing behind the broken glass. It pressed against the surface, the cracks deepening, until I realized what it was trying to do. It was trying to get out. I grabbed the clock and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, pieces raining down onto the floor, but the shadow remained. It spilled out like ink, pooling on the countertop before coalescing into a shape. It wasn't human. It had limbs, long and thin, but they moved wrong, bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Its face was a smooth, featureless void, but I felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on me. The clock hands lay scattered among the broken glass, twitching. The shadow reached for them. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the apartment, but I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When I finally stopped, I was in an empty parking lot miles away. I sat there, trembling, my heart refusing to slow, when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was an alarm I didn't set. The time, 3:15 a.m. The tapping came from the back seat.